Hello and welcome back everyone, we Weeb Online, and today I'm gonna start a new series, What If Naruto Had a Legendary Uchiha Brother. If you enjoy this video, please give it a big thumbs up, and to watch more videos like this, subscribe to my channel and turn that bell notification on so you never miss an upload. Now wasting no more time, let's begin.
Madara ought to have been aware that Orochimaru would have discovered the graves of the former Uchiha clan leaders. It was inevitable that he would eventually shift his gaze from the Senju's remains to those of Konoha's other founding clan, given the nature of the Sannin's experiments. Luckily, he had learned of this experiment before the other man's intentions in that area could be carried out. Sarutobi Sasuke's son would eventually learn of his former pupil's actions, but given the man's prior conduct, it was unlikely that it would be until it was much too late for the one person who worried him. Far too tender-hearted, Sarutobi Hiruzen was not at all like his father, who had been a worthy opponent. He sneaked into one of Orochimaru's hidden facilities as Tobi, his living avatar who would be his representative from now on and handle the day-to-day forwarding of his plans until he was revived at the appropriate time, battled the Yondaime and tried his hardest to destroy the village with the Kyuubi Euro, a task he longed to do but was too old for. He wandered through the mostly deserted and quiet halls until he reached the room where he had found what he had been looking for this evening: a Euro. Clones of the Uchiha clan's leaders, clones that were still infants at the time and that Orochimaru had considered more of an intellectual exercise than anything else. After confirming that he had the correct group of babies, he proceeded down the short line of infants in search of a specific one, whom he had been given and instructed to look after and nurture until he was almost 4 years old. He knew Izuna's chakra as well as his own, despite the fact that they were all of the same line and that his father's clone was the most similar. Despite the small amount of chakra that these little abominations would grow up unaware of, his brother's copy, which was created from a piece of his brother that had been taken from his grave, shone out to him like a tiny beacon. He had considered killing the boy after learning about the experiment, but he cared for his brother more than anything else, and it had been somewhat consoling to think that he would have a living reminder of his brother in the world after being away from him for so long. The decision to allow the clone to live had not been finalized until he had gazed down in the bassinet that had surely been stolen from the hospital. He was surprised to discover, however, that instead of lowering a kunai towards the infant for a lethal blow, he was gently lifting it from the bassinet and holding it in his arms, just as he had done with the first Izuna back when he was a baby, when he saw those wide dark eyes staring up at him. When he first held his brother's clone in his arms, he had no idea what to anticipate. He had known not to expect much based on what he had read about cloning, but it had hurt when his brother's eyes were unrecognizable and the baby started to fuss over being held by a stranger instead of settling down and sleeping like his younger brother did. He made the decision to take action because he didn't like the hurt he was experiencing because the one person in the universe who should always be able to identify him didn't. That something included the clone of his grandfather and theoretical exercises involving out branches and improvements of a particular jutsu of Senju Tobirama's. His clone would be far more useful in death than the man had ever been in life, and he hadn't really liked him the first time. After leaving Orochimaru's lab with 2 stolen infants, he completed the deed and left the woods where he had done it. He then found and hired a wet nurse to handle the things his brother was unable to handle on his own because he was living in an infant's body. 3 years later, fairly certain that his brother would now have control over his biological functions, be able to feed and dress himself, and be prepared to travel with him, he returned to the home of the wet nurse who had lived in an isolated village in a remote corner of Fire Country after taking care of several important tasks in preparation for his death. But when he got to the wet nurse's house, he discovered what appeared to be a typical 3-year-old boy who could untie his own shoes, spoke in toddler jargon, and didn't seem to recognize him based on the fact that he didn't respond when asked, "Who are you?" Aside from the fact that he had completely failed to place Izuna's soul in its proper body using the experimental seal and jutsu combination he had developed, the only explanation he could think of for why this had occurred was that an infant's mind was ill-equipped to process adult memories and had thus eliminated them. Since the youngster was his brother's blood, he accepted a piece of macaroni art from him and then slunk away, disappointed, but with hazy plans to take the child on as his apprentice when he returned. When the time came, he had instructed the wet nurse to send the child to Suna for ninja training, and he left, never to be seen again. The young boy wondered why he was thinking of the older boy who had pushed him over while he was walking, picked him up, and held him while he sobbed over his injured knee, and connected that boy with the man who was leaving. He never saw the child's expression as he left. He would have known that the memories were there, but mostly obscured by the young boy's mind, which was unable to comprehend most of them yet and pushed them away until it could grasp them instead of risking breaking. He would have also known that nearly every time the young boy encountered something he had seen before, a similar memory from his previous life would resurface, completing another piece of the puzzle and bringing back a tiny piece of his brother. A young boy named Izuna experienced an unexplainable sadness as Madara vanished beyond the horizon. For the first time since he had outgrown his awful twos, he did not smile joyfully when he was given a new toy or his favorite food at dinner or when he was permitted to play with his toy boats during bath time. As it happened, the wet nurse had been ordered, so Izuna was not taken to Sunagaku to receive ninja training when he was 6. This was because the woman had passed away in a domestic mishap while Madara was playing on the lawn, less than a week after he had paid him a visit and departed for the final time before his scheduled resurrection. As they passed through on their way back to the hidden village, the woman's neighbor, thinking the child would have better chances in Konoha, gave Izuna to a border patrol unit. Shortly after they returned to Konoha, the squad leader who had been thinking about keeping him saw a seal on the boy while bathing him. Unable to figure out what it was, she took him to a specialist she knew. The boy was then taken by the expert to another expert, who in turn took him to the Hokage. The Hokage examined it carefully and concluded that, at this point, nothing could be done. The Hokage decided it was safe to leave the boy at the orphanage because the seal didn't appear to be harming anyone and the boy appeared to be a typical 3-year-old with some strange memories. Izuna's arrival at the orphanage most likely would have been the end of it if the villagers had been a little kinder and less suspicious of things that were a little out of the ordinary. He had been granted a second chance at life, and he would have been contentedly navigating a civilian school by the time he would have regained all of his memories. He would have been helping an elderly man every afternoon after school in exchange for training in a job he loved but had not been able to do the first time around due to the life he had been born into. Toby wouldn't have bothered him if his fictitious life had gone on in this rather idyllic way because he hadn't been informed about him because he wasn't essential to the plan, and by the time Madara was brought back to life, he wouldn't have had time to take him on as an apprentice because he would have been brought back in the middle of combat. Regretfully, speculation regarding the intended use of the seal that the ninja who had brought Izuna to Konoha had found had spread, jeopardizing any future plans for just such a civilian life. The tale of how Izuna had been used to bring a deceased man's soul back to life and how that man's soul had been trapped in his body instead of the one he was born with had spread from one end of the village to the other by the time he arrived at the orphanage. There was a lot of conjecture about who this person who had been brought back to life using this horrifying method was and how wicked he must have been to approve of such a thing. Since there were no other available rooms and the blonde brat who had attempted to set his mattress on fire the previous week could take care of himself, the orphanage's matron had decided to separate the boy from the other kids and place him with Naruto after noticing that his eyes were far too old for a child his age. In her opinion, she had no intention of letting a man who was still unknown sleep in the same room as the kids in her care and possibly endangering them. Izuna stood in the doorway of what would have been his new room, staring at the other boy who would be his roommate while Naruto tried to figure out why the orphanage staff had placed another bed in his room. It was the brightest yellow he had ever seen in hair. Naruto, who had never seen so much grass before, grinned as he ran across the field. The boy who had moved into his room and taken the extra bed that the caretakers had placed there when he arrived the week before, which seemed like a lifetime ago to him, and the glances that the villagers had given him vanished from his immediate memory. A lot of things rolled off of him without sticking because he had never had a long attention span. The day was going well right now, and nothing else was going on. Everywhere he looked, he could see grass, the sky was blue with tiny, puffy white clouds, and the sun was bright and shiny. As he pursued the other boy, Izuna's smile was nearly as big as Naruto's. As was customary for young children who were not properly watched over, the two boys had sneaked out of the orphanage a few hours earlier and wandered the village until they arrived at one of the training grounds, which was much bigger than the meager lawn that was connected to the orphanage and used as its playground. Both kids enjoyed this place because they didn't know the dangers of playing around on the training grounds and getting caught between two sparring ninja or tripping and falling on a weapon that had been left behind by a negligent owner. The only things that worried them were the bright sun, the green grass that tickled, and the game of chase they were currently engaged in. In the week since the dark-haired boy had arrived at the orphanage, Naruto and Izuna had been separated from the other kids the few times they had been allowed outside to play. Izuna's wet nurse, Sanraku, used to watch over him in the town where he used to live. When he attempted to play with the other kids, the people watching him pulled him away from the other kids and said, "Men aren't supposed to play with little children." He had Naruto, so he wasn't entirely alone, but he didn't understand what that was supposed to mean or why it meant he couldn't play with the other kids. While Naruto was pleasant, Madara ni was more pleasant. His Madara ni was missed. He was held by his Madara ni the night their father was taken away by fire and noise, and Madara ni had held him while he cried when. There is nothing to feel guilty for. They turned traitor to our clan and sold secrets about our defenses to the Senju. But he still felt bad about what he and his brother had to do that day. Somehow, the new power it had given him felt unclean. Hours later, the guilt of killing two cousins he had loved and cared for two cousins he and Madara had played with as children still stung his eyes. Despite Madara's repeated denials, he knew that he also felt guilty. The blood that had left red tear traces down his brother's face was as clear as those eyes that had just stopped crying. To get the memory out of his head, he shook his head. When he tried to understand it, the things from his childhood hurt. He eventually caught up to Naruto, who was running in circles, after refocusing on the game, and he tackled him just like he used to Madara ni. Naruto appeared momentarily shocked when they came to a halt after rolling over a few times, but he soon burst out laughing. He smiled back at his friend with the sunny hair and began to tickle him. His blonde companion laughed even harder at this. Someone suddenly grabbed him as he was switching between tickling Naruto's belly and his side. It was among those wearing animal masks. The man, wearing red robes, a white overcoat, and a red and white hat that read, "Fire," picked Naruto up as he writhed in his grasp, examined him closely, and then tickled his side. The man wearing the fire hat he had seen before being abandoned at the orphanage asked the laughing boy, "How did you get out here, Naruto?" Naruto answered, "Me and Zuna escaped." "Zuna show how. Zuna's lots smart." The man wearing the fire hat narrowed his eyes, indicating that he was in trouble, and asked, did he? Before he left, his father used to give him that look. The man wearing the fire hat continued to stare at Naruto and asked, "Did Izuna tell you where you were going?" "Yep, outside," was Naruto's cheerful response. "Outside where?" the man wearing the fire hat inquired, his face growing even more gloomy. Naruto responded with a chirp, outside. The man wearing the fire hat said, "I see." Then he made a hand gesture that brought a man wearing a rat-like mask into view. The man wearing the fire hat handed Naruto to the man wearing the rat mask and said, "Well, Naruto, you've had quite the adventure, but now it's over. Nezumi here will be taking you back to the orphanage." "What's up with Zuna?" inquired Naruto. That man with the fire hat said, "I have to talk to him about something. Now be a good boy and go with Nezumi, Naruto." Just before he and the man wearing the rat mask vanished, Naruto said, "K. Bye. Bye Zuna." The man with the fire hat's expression changed as soon as Naruto left. The loving glance he had given him instantly disappeared, and his face took on a more serious and mean expression. When he turned to face him, he didn't like the way he looked. After his father left, Madara ni used to gaze at the Senju in that manner. The man wearing the fire hat said, "Take him to Inoichi. The Yamanaka that we had examine him when he arrived might not have done a thorough enough job of checking him, and I don't want to take any chances, especially since he seems to have been an associate of Uchiha Madara if the reports I've received are accurate." The Sandaime went back to his office, sighed, and sat down in his chair to start working on the papers he had left behind. When he learned that Naruto had disappeared from the orphanage, he almost had a heart attack. He had been on the verge of going out there and killing the boy when he began to receive reports that he had been spotted walking toward the village's edge with the boy who had been brought to his attention the previous week. He had actually come dangerously close to killing the boy on the training ground, but he and his Anbu guards were spared because of that little nagging doubt that things might have been much more innocent than they appeared to be, and that the boys were engaging in some kind of childish adventure similar to what his own children had engaged in. His hand would remain in place until he received a clear explanation of the boy's identity. The fate of this Izuna would be determined by Inoichi's report. Izuna would survive if he was the naive youngster he seemed to be. If Izuna was something else, he would perish regardless of how adorable or innocent the package he was in looked. Although he truly disliked killing children, he would stop at nothing to ensure Naruto's safety, and if it turned out that Izuna wasn't as innocent as he seemed, it wouldn't be considered child murder in this instance. Izuna was a healthy 3-year-old boy with the occasional recollection of being older, according to the examination that had been performed on him when he first arrived in Konoha. When he offered the child custody after the exam results were announced, the Uchiha clan rejected him and strongly advised him to get rid of him. He sent the boy to the orphanage where he had met Naruto, and the young Jinchuriki had bonded with him, making him an even bigger Hidachi Euro, especially if he had to kill him after Inoichi's report Arrivada Euro, instead of killing him as he probably should have done because he didn't want the blood of a toddler on his hands. In the weeks since he had sent the boy to the orphanage, he had received a few concerning reports from the people keeping an eye on both Izuna and Naruto, who were conveniently in the same room. It was assumed that the boy was referring to Uchiha Madara because he had been heard yelling for a Madara at night. It had not yet been established whether this was the behavior of a child calling out for an older relative or something more sinister. As he waited for Inoichi's report, the Hokage returned to his paperwork, aware that he was likely making the same mistake again and that instead of playing with the risk to see when it would blow up in his face, he should be removing it. He was aware that he would be solely responsible if this ended up being similar to the Hyuga snafu. With luck, Danzo would be able to sniff out the problem and solve it before he had to. If that were true, he would ensure that Danzo was left to explain to a distraught Naruto why his one and only friend in the world had to perish. Inoichi pulled away from the boy's mind, which was confined on the table in front of him, and felt a little queasy. But since it had been unclear whether the boy was a danger to the village or merely a boy, it had to be done. It was highly likely that this had been an attempt at infiltration by a particularly reprehensible enemy ninja, willing to risk death to accomplish this and possibly bring Konoha to its knees. He could inform the Hokage, who had been uneasy about the possibility of killing the boy, that the child did not appear to pose a threat to the village. A good ninja, or at least a sane ninja, considered killing carefully when it wasn't obviously part of the mission. Ninjas killed when they had to. After spending several hours examining the boy in detail, he had conclusively identified the soul that resided in the boy's body. In addition to concluding that the boy had a child's mind and was therefore fundamentally a child, even though the memories were present in the background, waiting to be processed by the boy. Uchiha Izuna, Uchiha Madara's younger brother, had his soul in the boy. He had no idea how, or even why, he held this man's soul. It couldn't be a coincidence that the rotting bodies of a number of Uchiha infants that the clan had been unaware of were found during the raid on Orochimaru's facility almost 3 years prior. If the dead Uchiha babies who had never been born to the clan and the boy who was a child with the memories of a dead man locked away where he currently couldn't get at them were any indication, then whatever Orochimaru had been attempting to do in his quest for immortality had clearly not gone as planned. With a sigh, he picked up the little boy on the table, who was roughly his daughter's age, and carried him to the tea-and-eye break room, where he would feel more at ease. Similar to Orochimaru's Mokuden experiment, which had been in the Sanin lab since the child was a baby and was now around 13, the child's life had been ruined essentially before it had even started. After placing the boy with a young secretary for the department who tried her best to soothe him, he departed and went to the Hokage's office to personally present his findings. Before delivering his report to the man, the Hokage tried to gather his thoughts and asked, "Well, right now, Izuna, aged approximately 3 years, is just a child." He began. With suspiciously narrowed eyes, the Hokage questioned, "What do you mean right now?" He possesses most or all of the memories of his former self, but they have mostly been blocked by his mind, which isn't ready or able to process them yet. At the rate some of the memories are slipping through, I would estimate that the block on those memories will have mostly dissipated by the time he reaches his teens. He responded. The Hokage questioned, "And these memories that are slipping through? They're mostly stuff from when he was a few years older than he is now, though there are a few memories from after he reached adulthood. Most of those are memories of the field of battle, which isn't all that surprising considering how strong such memories tend to be." He responded. "Have you made any progress in determining whose spirit resides in the boy's body?" Asked the Hokage. "It is the soul of one Uchiha Izuna, who was the younger brother of Uchiha Madara." He responded. The Hokage tensed, then relaxed a little, and said, "I see." Since the Hokage was born soon after Konoha was founded, he likely knew more about this Izuna person's background than anyone in his generation would, as the man had not, as far as he could recall, been included in the Academy's history books or in any of the materials he could find about Konoha's founding when he was younger. After giving it some serious thought, the Hokage asked, "In your opinion, is Izuna a threat to Naruto?" "No, he's rather attached to the other boy and sees him as a friend." He replied. The Hokage lit his pipe and said, "Thank you. I would like to see a full report on your findings later." You're dismissed. Leaning back in his chair, Sarutobi Hiruzen, who had served as Hokage for more time than the Shodai and Nadaime Hokages combined, thought about the issue that had been presented to him. The child Naruto had grown to love and cling to was, on the one hand, a child. The child, on the other hand, would not always stay that way and would eventually regain his memories of his adult life. On the one hand, Izuna was Uchiha Madara's only sibling to live to adulthood. However, Izuna had also had his eyes stolen by the aforementioned brother, and since he had passed away long before Madara had taken control of the Kyuubi, he probably would not have known the secret. The boy was both a possible threat and maybe the best thing that could have happened to Naruto. He didn't like killing innocent children, which is what the boy was doing at the moment, but he also didn't want to let a possible threat rest in Konoha. And if the boy still loved Naruto as much as he did now, it appeared that he would need to summon one more individual before making a decision regarding the child's destiny. Because of this, he asked one of the secretaries to come to his office and invite Uchiha Fugaku. Fugaku appeared 20 minutes later, looking just as miserable and disagreeable as he had ever done since the Kyuubi attack. The man appeared to have lost the ability to smile over the past 3 years, and he had changed from the harsh, fair, and somewhat likable person he once was to something completely more disagreeable. He lamented this change and the circumstances that probably preceded it. In fact, he enjoyed hanging out with young Fugaku before the attack. But not as much now. After the formalities were over, he asked the man, "What do you know about Uchiha Izuna?" "Uchiha Izuna?" Fugaku inquired, then paused to consider, before posing the question, "Which one are you asking about?" He recalled that during his lifetime, there had been a female Junin, two Chunin, and an academy student with that name. None of them belonged to the same generation, and only the academy student was still alive. "Uchiha Madara's younger brother," he responded. A frown came over Fugaku's face as he tried to remember what had been asked for. After some time, Fugaku answered, "My grandfather used to talk about him a lot when I was a kid. Itachi's sort of named after him. He led the clan at Madara's side until he fell in battle. They used to call him the heart of the Uchiha clan. I think that he was more liked than Madara was, and that was one of the reasons that the clan had been almost glad to see the back of Madara when he departed after the founding, since his taking of Izuna's eyes had been seen as what had been the cause of his death." "Why do you ask?" The information that Fugaku had given him made the Hokage feel even more at ease because it sounded very promising. When he recalled that his clan had been at war with the Senju for generations, he was especially hoping to strengthen the ties between the boy and the village before he lost all of his memories. Even now, the Uchiha still harbor a great deal of resentment toward that long-gone war, which tends to be dismissed by those connected to the Senju. He finally responded to Fugaku's question by saying, "No reason in particular, I just wanted to set my mind at ease about certain things." He then took a seat. Before sipping the tea that one of the secretaries had brought him, Fugaku questioned, "It's about that boy who turned up, isn't it?" Before sipping his own tea, he answered, in a manner of speaking. Despite the fact that this meeting was between equals, he had attempted to portray it as such rather than as one in which a superior was requesting information from a subordinate. Given the recent treatment of the Uchiha, showing off that fact a Euro, or at least giving the impression that one was a Euro, would probably annoy Fugaku greatly and led him to withhold information out of animosity. Fugaku questioned, "Is that all you want?" He answered, "Yes." Fugaku placed his cup on the low table at which they were seated and said, "Then I shall take my leave of you." Fugaku made the decision to let the child Izuna live as he left. According to the reports he had received, the boy had developed a bond with Naruto, and neither child had any chance of making any new friends at the orphanage. If Izuna grew close to the boy as he believed he would because they were practically alone together before he fully remembered who he was, it might avert any potential mischief involving a certain Uchiha and the Kyuubi. He didn't want his successor's son to grow up alone like most other Jinchuriki did, especially in light of the mental health issues that tended to arise later in life. He could benefit from this, or at the very least, it wouldn't be a total catastrophe if he played his cards correctly. Fugaku found himself complaining as he returned to his station office and the enormous pile of documents he had left on his desk after responding to the Hokage's summons. He had been complaining a lot lately, and today's subject was Izuna, the reason he had been called to the Hokage's office. Out of all the strong Uchiha they could have picked, they had to bring back Izuna. He murmured, "Madara would have been useful. Izuna, however, if what I heard about him was true, he would have agreed with all of that will of fire crap and, Even worse, the brat doesn't even have his memories. He was on the verge of using a blunt object to strike the person who had pulled Uchiha Izuna back from the afterlife. Several times. They ought to have made sure they were helpful if they were going to raise someone from the grave. Additionally, they should have brought back Madara, not the one who had been urging peace for so long that the Uchiha accepted the Senju's offer shortly after his death, even though the Senju had killed him after Madara took his eyes, if they were going to bring back the strongest Uchiha. Izuna deserved to remain in the orphanage, in his opinion. He was an abomination, aside from the fact that he was useless, and no one in his clan would want to adopt him, despite his own delusions. When the dead return, they should either remain dead or at the very least be useful to the living. By the time he returned, Izuna was dead and of no use. He was therefore not welcome in his clan. Worried, Naruto bit his lip. It had been a long time since Izuna returned. Izuna had not returned after he had eaten dinner and gone to bed. He was still absent when the sun rose again. The door opened as he was preparing breakfast without Izuna, and the dark-haired boy who had been on his mind for hours a euro, longer than any other thought or person had ever held his interest a euro, entered the room. Izuna appeared to be crying, but he was too thrilled to be seeing his friend again to give that any thought. He joyfully exclaimed, "Izuna," and sprinted across the room to embrace his friend. When he did, Izuna began to cry. Concerned for his friend who had been gone for so long, he inquired, "What's wrong, Izuna?" Izuna began to cry even harder. In the hopes that it would stop him, he gave his friend another hug. He was feeling like crying as well. After his adventures became too much for the orphanage staff to handle, Izuna sighed and considered whether it was worth the risk to use the stove thing in the apartment he and Naruto had moved into the week before. It seems that you could teach elemental ninjutsu to a 5-year-old as long as it was a lower-rank technique that wasn't heavily reliant on chakra. Given that he had previously learned the Great Fireball technique when he was 7 years old, it shouldn't have come as a huge surprise. Although his memory was hazy in some places, he recalled being around 10 years old and accompanying his brother, who had been 14, into combat, so he knew when he had learned the Grand Fireball technique. Additionally, he recalled that he had been a little older than he and Naruto were now when he had first used Kawarimi, Henge, and Bunshin no Yuro, the 3 fundamental jutsu that all Uchiha children were taught so they could run and hide during a surprise attack. People at the orphanage told him repeatedly that he had been a man at one point, and he had a few memories of being much larger than he was at 10, so he knew that there were more memories he would eventually regain. When he was older than 10, the majority of those memories were of fighting alongside Madara ni. For nearly as long as the Hokage had been alive, Madara ni had been absent. As more and more memories came flooding back, Madara ni always seemed to be right there. He missed Madara ni so much that it was painful. He would never see Madara ni again. The small wind technique he had taught Naruto, who was actually 5 years old, but the caretakers at the orphanage seemed to believe he was something else entirely, didn't mix well with his fireball, which he could now remember how to do. In actuality, they had gotten along a little too well, and that had been the final straw for the orphanage because they had to get a new roof even though the fireball he had created was much smaller than the large ones he could have made when he was 10. He had accidentally crossed the thing with the wind technique, which was intended to remove tracks from sand, grass, or other surfaces, which he had taught Naruto when they had been hiding on the roof playing ninja. This was the reason the orphanage needed a new roof. The Hokage had to find a new home for himself, Naruto, and numerous other orphans after the fire was finally extinguished because they couldn't live in an orphanage with charred beams for a roof. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, there had been a rush of adoptions, but he and Naruto had not been placed with new families. Even though Naruto appeared to be a normal boy, who wanted someone who had previously died and whatever the hell he was perceived to be. After they had moved in, it had been implied that he would be the one taking care of Naruto going forward. Ultimately, he and Naruto had been assigned a modest apartment in one of the less desirable areas of the city. Because he liked Naruto, he didn't mind taking care of the boy he'd kind of adopted as his younger brother, but he also kind of dreaded it because taking care of Naruto required 3 people to work full-time. However, he was relieved to be living alone with Naruto and not have to worry about constant supervision anymore. Over the years, the staff at the orphanage had become increasingly nasty in their glares. The staff at the orphanage had been closely observing him and Naruto while they were there, particularly when he attempted to engage with the other kids. He suspected that this was because they believed he was still a man, and he had been one in the past. Because they were unaware of his previous identity, they apparently believed he was one of the evil people who had harmed children. It clarified why, when Naruto was 3 years old, the Hokage had taken him out of the orphanage for a day on the town and sent him to that eerie blonde man with the odd eyes that had entered his head. They most likely believed that he was attempting to do something else when he was tickling Naruto, something involving women, particularly redheads, that he couldn't fully recall or comprehend. Although he didn't fully trust the Hokage, it appeared that he now trusted him with Naruto. Naruto would be returning from the Hokage's office in time for lunch if everything went according to plan. This meant that he needed to have the meal fixed by the time he got back so that he could show the Hokage that they were responsible enough to keep the apartment they were given rather than having it sent back to the orphanage when it got a new roof. That was going to be a problem today because he would actually have to cook something because he and Naruto had just run out of raw food. Something would be difficult to cook. He didn't trust the stove, not because he didn't know how to cook, since his grandmother had taught him how when he was 9 years old. When he had attempted to learn more about electricity, the person who had explained it to him had brought up lightning and lightning jutsus. He had also been informed that the stove was powered by electricity. Anything that was powered by the same source as a lightning jutsu was not something he was going to trust. Those things are painful and have the potential to quickly kill you. Having discovered the true nature of electricity, he had prohibited Naruto from obtaining the television device he had desired or, for that matter, from turning on the lights. His decision was unaffected by the fact that the lights at the orphanage had appeared to function flawlessly. He would have tried his hardest to keep them all off if he had known what powered them back when he and Naruto lived there. As far as the Hokage was concerned, the candles he bought when he was getting supplies for the apartment were more than adequate. They provided enough light to see by. He went to the stove and turned it on, wishing for a nice, safe cook fire but knowing that he couldn't make one because there weren't enough ways to get the smoke out of the apartment. He didn't see any fire, and he didn't know how food was meant to cook on it without one. Heat started to radiate off the top of the stove gradually, though he wasn't entirely sure how. He discovered that the front flat metal coil on the left was the source of the heat when he ran his hand over the stove's surface. He prodded it and quickly withdrew his burned finger, almost toppling over the chair he was standing on in the process. That's how it operated. This stove device heated metal coils, similar to kunai, that had become lodged in a fire using lightning. He did not, however, trust the stove any more than he trusted anything else that was powered by electricity. He was going to use it only once, to prepare lunch as fast as possible, and then he would figure out how to solve the cook fire issue. On the tiny balcony, maybe, is some kind of metal container. Naruto returned carrying the Hokage while he was frying a few eggs for lunch. As he bounded into the apartment, Naruto exclaimed, "Hey Izuna ni, guess what TT Ibeo?" He said, "What TT Ibane?" He had tried to get rid of the verbal tic throughout his childhood and likely into adulthood, but the other boy had somehow picked it up. At times, he had been ostensibly successful, particularly after Madara ni began hitting him over the head whenever he said it. Madara ni had informed him that their mother, whom he hardly remembered, had taught him the bothersome habit. Every time he did something that the man thought was strange, the Hokage gave him a look that was a mix of surprise and suspicion as he flipped Naruto's portion of the eggs onto a plate. The strangest things seemed to make the man suspicious of him, and he had no idea what it was that had attracted the man's attention this time. Naruto exclaimed, "The Hokage took me out to eat ramen." Fantastic. He had risked breaking his neck, burned his finger, cooked 3 extra eggs, and all of that trouble for nothing. The Hokage surveyed the apartment he had given the boys while Naruto devoured his second lunch. It wasn't the greatest, but it wasn't the worst either, and the boys could afford it with their meager income. The apartment's rather good view of the Hokage monument was one of its better features, and he believed it would inspire Naruto, who had earlier that year declared his intention to become Hokage. It was no accident that the apartment was closest to the Yondaime's face compared to the others. Looking at the man's face through the window gave the impression that he was keeping watch over his son, something he had failed to do in life. He had intended to hold off on giving Naruto the apartment until he was around 7 years old, but Izuna-caused circumstances compelled him to do so. Given that the consequences of certain actions had not yet been hammered home, a child with the mentality and impulse control of a 5-year-old and the memory of a brilliant 10-year-old who had been taught to be independent practically from day one was sure to cause trouble. Thankfully, the issues the child had caused this time could be fixed, and the lecture he had received seemed to have had enough of an impact to make him reconsider doing something similar to what he and Naruto had done the previous week. Hopefully, No more catastrophes of this magnitude would occur before the boy's impulse control matured. Although the boy's actions had cost Konoha a lot of money, given the discovery made by the repair crew, it was fortunate that the orphanage caught fire when it did, when nearly all of the children were outside and everyone could escape. An electrical issue that could have caused a potentially fatal fire at any time was discovered during a check of the building to determine whether it needed any urgent repairs. Since they were spending money to replace the roof, they might as well take care of any other issues the orphanage had. The problem was in an area that would have made it difficult to escape the building in time. If the issue hadn't been identified and resolved in a timely manner, dozens of kids, including Naruto, might have perished. At the moment, the boy's new apartment was tidy, with everything appearing to be stored away. Since none of the lights were on, the place was rather dark due to the heavy blanket that had been thrown across the window that should have received a lot of natural light, especially in the early morning, in place of blinds. Apart from the light coming in through the open door and the faint ruddy glow from the stove burner, the only lights were the single candle on the small kitchen table. His question to no one in particular was, why are all of the lights off? While Izuna was preoccupied with preparing some of the bacon he had purchased when he had moved the boys into the apartment, Naruto responded, Izuna doesn't like them. I think he's scared of them. He was attempting to snatch an egg off Izuna's plate. In a way, that made sense. In the more rural areas, electricity was practically non-existent when Uchiha Izuna was a young child. Back when it had occurred, the construction of the generator and the electrical wiring of Konoha had been significant. During his childhood, he had heard tales of elderly residents refusing to have their houses wired for a number of reasons, chief among them being a lack of faith in electricity and the gadgets that relied on it. He had no idea, however, why the boy had not displayed any signs of this at the orphanage and had waited until he had been given an apartment before rejecting technology almost completely. He noticed Izuna's tiny flinch and the cautious expression on the boy's face as he flipped the switch by the door to turn on the light in the apartment's main room, seemingly confirming Naruto's response. When he looked at the switch and the light fixture in the light, he couldn't help but laugh when he saw two seals that looked almost exactly like the seals on the roof of the Hokage Tower and a few other tall buildings in the village. These seals drew and absorbed lightning to protect the rest of the building. Since he didn't want this apartment to catch fire because one of the boys had left a candle unattended, he would need to talk to the boy later to help him overcome his unreasonable fear of electricity. Izuna dragged Naruto inside to put his futon out and go to bed as the sun was setting, keeping himself turned away from the Hokage monument. He had always felt a sense of loss and something else whenever he gazed at the monument, which had 4 faces of slightly weathered stone that were carved to resemble the leaders of the village. This was especially true of the first 2 faces. After giving it a lot of thought, he concluded that it was because the monument emphasized that Madara was dead and would not be returning, especially since no one other than the person who had raised him from the grave knew how he had done it. He knew that he had passed away before those faces were etched on the cliffside, but he was unsure of how long it had been since his death. The few conversations he'd had with the Hokage had given him that impression. He had once been told by the village elder that he had passed away before his birth, and he had heard that the Hokage had been born in the year that Konoha was established. He was able to usher Naruto from the balcony, which appeared to be his favorite spot in the building, into the apartment so that he could get ready for bed while attempting to keep his thoughts off the monument and its significance to him. Like every day he attempted to teach reading to a certain hyperactive child who wasn't very studious, tomorrow was going to be hectic and frustrating. But the boy, who was more interested in running loose in the village and the nearby woods now, would probably never learn if he didn't teach him. He could have been at the academy by now for his own education, but he chose to wait for Naruto to help him through it. Naruto needed to be able to read hiragana at a level that was at least as high as what was expected of a civilian first grader before he could enroll in the academy. As the Aniki, now, it was his responsibility to care for Naruto in the same way that Madara had cared for him. In order to avoid being noticed by the man working the front desk at the KMPF station, Naruto smiled as he ducked down to enter covertly. As he was painting a picture for Izuna, he was playing a practical joke on the cruel man who had stopped by the apartment and inquired about Izuna's eyes. He nearly hit him when the paint flew off his brush and got on his pants. Izuna, who also disliked the cruel man, had claimed that Madara, or someone similar, had led the Uchiha clan, whatever it was, far more effectively. Izuna had laughed, ruffled his hair, said, "Okay," and told him what kind of prank he should play when he offered to play a practical joke on the cruel man. When he didn't try to pull pranks on Izuna, he enjoyed them. Izuna used to call the moment he used cooking oil to grease the orphanage hallway brilliant when he first started. He laughed until he started crying when the matron slid down the hall. That wasn't what he had intended to do. When he spilled some cooking oil, he spread it around so it wouldn't be obvious that he had done so, saving himself the trouble of cleaning it up. He had been carrying the oil out to the trash as he was supposed to. He was caught by Izuna, who found his actions amusing, particularly after the matron in charge of the orphanage slipped. He eventually made it to the small officer's break room, where his target was, after much skulking around the police station to execute today's prank. He glanced around to make sure everything was in order, then stepped into the room, pushed a chair up against the counter, and climbed up on it. Just like in the staff room of the orphanage, the large round can he was aiming for was situated directly next to the coffee maker. He looked inside to see how much ground coffee was in the can, then he removed it and tossed its contents in the garbage. He then took out a second, identically sized can from his bag that Izuna had purchased especially for this practical joke. He opened one can and began filling the other with its contents. One of the Uchiha who oversaw the station entered at that moment. The man said, "What the?" before he finally reacted and grabbed him. When Uchiha Fugaku looked up from his paperwork in the middle of what had been a long and dull afternoon, he saw Yashira entering his office with a small boy who, in his view, was nothing more than a threat, much like his mother had been, and who, according to the general public, was the demon that was sealed within him. He might have grown to like the child if he had possessed some traits of his father besides his hair and eyes, but he didn't. He had respected the boy's father, even though he hadn't liked him personally. However, the mother of the boy. He put a file aside and said, "Yashira, why do you have the Uzumaki child with you?" Yashira smirked in amusement and said, "The little guy was trying to switch our coffee to decaf." Given the brat's notoriously destructive tendencies, he was shocked that that was all the child had attempted to do while he was out of control in his station. "Why would he do that?" he asked. "Because you were mean to me and Izuna." The boy, who was hidden beneath Yashira's arm, cried from the other side of the room. He was perplexed by the boy's behavior and questioned, "But, why decaf?" He had also never been able to understand the boy's mother's mental processes. He wouldn't have understood why Namikaze had married her if she hadn't been so attractive. "'Cause Hokage Gigi said that that was the most evil thing you could do to a person when he'd found out that the secretaries had changed his coffee for health reasons," the boy replied. Yashira, who had a young grandchild who was around a year younger than the Uzumaki brat, lost it at that moment and began snickering quietly before moving the boy into a position that was likely more comfortable for the man but too close for his preferences. The Uzumaki was no longer slung beneath the man's arm, but rather pressed against his side as his arm held the boy's butt so he wouldn't fall, the way one would hold a big baby or a toddler who, now that he considered it, wouldn't be much smaller than the Uzumaki. "Yashira, you will make that," he said, gesturing to the Uzumaki, who was staring up at the man bewildered. "Clean up the mess it made and pay for the coffee it wasted, and then you will get it out of our station as quickly as possible, preferably without anyone knowing it was here." Yashira turned and walked away with the Uzumaki he was still carrying after saying, "Yes, sir." When Yashira and the boy were gone and his office door was shut, he let out a sigh and rubbed his temples. This was an impending headache. His wife understood why she had to leave the boy at the orphanage, even though she had a soft spot for the Uzumaki boy's mother. Because of the charges made against the Uchiha clan, it had become standard procedure to stay away from the Uzumaki at all costs and to turn him over to the Anbu when he became unruly. Problems might arise if the Uzumaki child were observed with a Uchiha other than Izuna, who was born Uchiha and lived in a body that was biologically Uchiha, as most of the villagers were unaware. No, it would lead to issues. Issues that he would be forced to cope with as Shimura attempted to further distance himself from their clan, and the Hokage ignored him during this time. Even though the Uchiha had a tendency to congregate prior to the Kyuubi attack, being stranded in that upscale area on the outskirts of town, cut off from everyone else, had been difficult enough. It had been a decision back then. Izuna asked, "So, how did it go?" While tending to the meat on the little grill he had learned to use some of the more traditional ninja techniques that had apparently been forgotten. Those academy kids shouldn't have left their portable grill out in the open for anyone to take if they didn't want it taken. He'd taught them a good lesson by stealing the grill. I got caught changing the coffee, and they made me clean it up and emptied Gama-chan, but Uchiha Yashira Oyaji gave me a cookie and said I was cute. Naruto responded. The current clan head had come to ask the Uchiha if he had activated his Sharingan and had threatened to tear out his eyes if he did anything against the clan. Although the clan had apparently decided not to acknowledge him because they hadn't attempted to get him from the orphanage or have him move into their district, Naruto had gone to play a practical joke for him. Because he didn't want his younger brother to turn against his former clan, he had advised the boy to take a modest action. To put it mildly, clan policy was severe when it came to enemies. Evidently, things went better than expected, and the boy was caught just as he had anticipated. However, Naruto appeared to admire this Yashira character, so he would watch him to make sure he wasn't endangering Naruto's health and well-being. On one hand, he could count the number of people who were kind to Naruto. However, a week later, after he had gained the boy's trust enough to take food from him, one of those people had turned against him and attempted to poison him. As the boy watched him cook the rabbit he had found in the woods, he said, "Naruto, I thought you'd like to know that I'll be teaching you how to pitch a tent tomorrow." "Yay!" exclaimed Naruto, "You're the best big brother ever." As they shared their first meal together since the boy's return from his survival exercise, Uchiha Yashira grinned proudly at his youngest child, who would be graduating from the academy this year. Even though it could only have been 2 days at most, the boy was gorging himself on his food as though he hadn't eaten in a week. "So, how did the survival exercise go?" asked the man. His son frowned and said, "Someone stole our grill." "Really?" he inquired. He had assumed that it had been put away because he had noticed it wasn't in the stack of supplies his son had thrown in the hallway. "Yeah, the Hyuga had his tent stolen while he was asleep, and someone emptied out the Inuzuka's snare as well. She insists that it caught something, but there was nothing there when we came to check it," he said while eating his rice. He no longer smiled and told his son sternly, "I trust that this has taught you to better secure your personal belongings." He would give the person who stole the grill a hard time if he ever caught them. It was top of the line, so it had been pretty pricey. It was specifically designed to be portable, light, and resistant to rust and extremely high temperatures. It was also impossible to dent. His son, who seemed to share his thoughts, said glumly, "Yes, father." Hyuga Hiashi questioned the boy who had misplaced one of the clan's incredibly costly self-folding tents, "And you set traps around your campsite?" The boy's shoulders slumped even more than they had when he had been called into his presence, but he responded, "No sir." "Why not?" he inquired. "I didn't feel it necessary since we were within the boundaries of the village," replied the child. He remarked, "And yet, the tent was stolen." After giving the boy a lecture, Hiashi gave him a series of humiliating tasks to complete because he didn't want to activate the child's seal over a misplaced tent but also didn't want him to escape punishment for his negligence. It was someone else who deserved his ire, not the boy. Few people had the audacity to steal from the Hyuga, and if he did catch someone who had, he would ensure that they would never do it again. Knowing that he shouldn't find it funny a euro, especially since it had happened to his students a euro, the academy instructor who had overseen the survival exercise across town from the Hyuga, during which several items had been stolen, rewound the tape he had copied from the tape that contained video from the cameras that had been set up in a particular area of the forest surrounding Konoha. However, he had brought a recording of the highlights home with him because he thought it was hilarious. When the tape reached his favorite section, he hit play and called his friends over to the couch. As he finished circling a particular tent, the young boy on TV, who didn't appear to be older than 4, said, "No traps. No traps at all. Madarani would have killed me myself if I did something that stupid." The boy then carefully pushed the tent upward and over the little Hyuga, who was sleeping soundly in his sleeping bag and oblivious to what was happening to his tent, after pulling up the back stakes. The boy disassembled the tent, dragged it off, and pulled up the remaining stakes after the tent was out of the Hyuga's way. The Hyuga, not realizing that his tent was now gone, whimpered at the decline in temperature, balled himself up, and slept on. This made everyone in the group laugh. Definitely an old-school Uchiha. Uchiha Tekka, a snotty brat who had been assigned to his genin team during the war and who had previously consumed a number of drinks, choked out his laughter. "Our clan wrote the book on what to do with things that aren't nailed down." The instructor was tempted to invite the boy with the sticky fingers who was now emptying Inuzuka Hana's snare to the academy for a lecture on securing one's belongings, even though he knew what he was, after witnessing the results of that small demonstration of skill and a few others. After reporting to the Hokage, formally finishing what was unquestionably the mission from hell, Mizuki groaned as he sat on the seat he had dropped down on after a period of futile wandering across the hamlet. The task was raised from a mid-B to an A rank since the ninja he and his squad were supposed to protect the person they were escorting had a member in their group who was stronger than expected. He lost a teammate in the battle he and his team were in before the other members of the team could support them. The team had split up to deal with the threats that had ambushed them, and he and his teammate were stuck with an enemy Chunin who should have been a Junin by now. As if that weren't terrible enough, his comrade was slain by his kunai, which the opponent had captured when he threw it at the man and used to stab the close-range combatant. Even worse, his teammates discovered him almost cowering in the bushes and his teammate dead from a Konoha kunai when they finally came to help. More painful than anything had been the expressions in his colleagues' eyes at that very time. Apart from his best buddy Yumino Iruka, who was unaware of his flaws, he had a jealous streak that was well known, despite the fact that he was generally seen as a kind guy and a good person to be around. Making his friend Iraka Yuro, and anybody else he was envious of, for that Matera Yuro, feel worse was one of his favorite things to do when he was feeling down, and it had become a habit. In addition to being envious of Iruka's attention from everyone, even the Hokage, who wanted to hug and assist the unfortunate orphan, he had also been envious of his deceased friend, and his teammates were aware of this. But all he had done was make crude remarks about the man, remarks that had only been intended to hurt, remarks that his fellow colleagues had overheard and mistook for something else when they discovered the man dead, slain by his weapon. He had heard his friends, who had suddenly become distant from him, whispering behind his back the whole trip back to Konoha, and he knew what they were saying. The two of them remained after the Hokage dismissed the team after they had reported, and he was fully aware of what they would say to the elderly man in his absence. In the end, his kunai had killed the teammate he had been envious of. In the face of his teammates' suspicions, it didn't matter that it hadn't been his hand that had wielded it. He didn't even have the energy to glare at them like he had the few times he'd seen them before, when the demon and his servant, who had been brought back from the grave, passed by with a folded tent that had a portable grill that ninjas used to cook on when they were out in the field. Apparently, this made them pause. They both had a suspicious expression on their faces as they attempted to figure out what was wrong with their surroundings, and when they realized that he was the cause of their discomfort, they turned to confront him. Then, dropping his end of the tent, the demon raced toward him and stopped a few feet ahead of him. Then, as though it had never seen anything like him before, it began to examine him closely. As if assessing whether he posed a threat, the demon's servant hung back and watched him warily. "Was wrong," the demon said, approaching him till it nearly touched him. He would be prepared to swear that the worry in its eyes was real if he didn't know any different. He yelled, "My teammate died." At the beast, the thing suddenly threw itself at him, and before he could change his course, he was in a hug. Like he did with Izuna when he was depressed, Naruto gave the gray-haired man a hug. He was aware that people were saddened when things perished. The death of his ninja rat had made him melancholy. Once they acquired it, he and Izuna had trained it to perform stunts. It was unable to dodge traps, but it could turn over and plead. Unlike Hiro with his rabbit, he had not had to bury it. Before he could do so, the matron had referred to it as a filthy creature and tossed it in the garbage. The man scowled as he stared down at him while he hugged him. The scowl wasn't cruel. He scowled in confusion, as if he was unsure of what was happening and if he liked it or not. The man shoved him off his lap and onto the floor a few seconds later. When he hugged him, Izuna never did that. Yes, he was not supposed to give strangers hugs. It was a regulation. When the demon apologized after pushing it to the ground, Mizuki wasn't sure what to believe. The thing held him, patted his head, and whispered, "It's okay," after he had responded to its question and informed it that his friend, whom he had detested, had passed away. When it did so, the worried expression on its face remained fixed. The tent with the portable camping grill heaped on it caught his attention again, as he searched for something to cling to other than the demon's bizarre behavior. He questioned, "What are you two up to?" wondering what kind of sinister scheme a tent and a camping grill could be involved in. After a moment of bewilderment, the demon turned back to face his servant and became more cheerful. "Izuna's gonna show me how to pitch a tent. Datbayo," the demon exclaimed joyfully, startling him with his sudden shift in attitude that demonstrated the earlier worry was a mere charade and drawing attention from a number of onlookers. Every shinobi who turned to stare at them began to snicker for an odd reason. In response, the demon's servant slapped himself on the back of the head and said, "I have got to stop saying that. Not if you don't hurry up TT Ebane." At that moment, one of the Uchiha approached. The man with the graying brown hair said, "Hey, is that my grill?" The demon joyfully exclaimed, "Uchiha Yashiro Yaji." As soon as he saw the man, the Uchiha turned back to the demon's servant after saying, "Hello Naruto-chan," with a slight smile. "That is my grill," shouted the Uchiha. "Why do you have my grill?" To which the demon's servant said, "Unwritten shinobi rule number 1. Confused, the Uchiha and a few other shinobi questioned, "Always maintain your equipment." In an authoritative tone, the demon's servant inquired, "That's rule number 2. What's rule number 1? As he took the grill off of its place on top of the folded tent, the Uchiha retorted, "If you can carry it off without getting caught, it's yours. Hasn't been rule number 1 for decades. And besides, I just caught you. You should get out of here before the Hyuga decide to take their tent back." With a serious glance at the tent, the demon's servant said, "How do you know?" "The section of the woods that the academy students use for survival training has cameras so the instructors can make sure the students aren't killing each other, and grade their progress. The video of you swiping the Hyuga's tent became a hit overnight," responded the Uchiha. The demon's servant picked up his half of the tent and said, "Come Naruto, we're leaving." The two kids left as the demon fumbled to comply. The Uchiha sat down on the bench beside him and remarked, "Cute kids. Troublesome, but cute. If Izuna's capable of this at this age, it almost makes me believe the family legend about the time that he and Madara had walked off with a couple of the Senju houses." He found himself questioning, "How could you find the demon cute?" "Because yesterday, I realized that Naruto was just a child. Had he been a demon, he would have killed all of us when he snuck into the station unnoticed, or poisoned our coffee, not tried to switch it to decaf because it was quote the most evil thing a person could do to someone unquote," replied the Uchiha. Mizuki found himself chuckling in spite of himself and his circumstances. There was no other option because the mental picture of the Kyuubi altering the coffee of innocent people to decaf while they were not looking was too ridiculous. When he and Izuna ni arrived in the woods, Nato grinned. Izuna ni had promised to show him how to build a campfire so they could cook food and keep the camp warm, so it was good that their grill was gone. Although Izuna ni told him a story he had heard from an older clan member about an Uzumaki kid who once sneaked into the Uchiha camp and took the campfire without any explanation, there was less chance that anyone would steal that. The kid could have easily made his own campfire with or without seals. When Naruto and Izuna ni had the opportunity to visit the woods, they always had a great time. Everywhere he and Izuna ni went in the woods, no one was staring at them or chatting behind their backs as they went by. There were many fascinating things to observe and many new things to learn from Izuna ni, who had taught him which plants were off limits to eating, so being by himself in the woods didn't hurt as much. There were many of foods that you couldn't eat because they would make you ill. Thankfully, there were equally as many foods you could consume. As they paused in a small clearing close to one of the streams that provided water to Konoha, Izuna ni remarked, "This looks like a good spot. We seem to be far enough away from the training grounds that we won't be hit by stray weapons, and close enough to the village that people won't panic over the fact that we're gone." Following processing, filtering, contamination and poisoning testing, and, of course, fluoridation. It had been enjoyable to set up the tent. He didn't really know what he was doing, and when he was struck by one of the tent poles, it hurt, but it went away eventually, and by the time they were finished, the tent was standing and looked like a tent, which was nice. He crept inside to set up his and Izuna ni's bedrolls after they had successfully set up the tent to his and Izuna ni's satisfaction, while Izuna ni went to gather rocks from the stream for their bonfire. A large, menacing man with odd eyes was waiting outside the tent as he emerged. He appeared irate. The man with the long dark hair and the strange, black biting eyes, dressed in elegant, vintage clothing, was frowning down at him with his arms folded across his chest. The man's frown was different from the typical one he saw around the hamlet, it was considerably more irate. A promise of anguish seemed to accompany the frown. He hoped to never see such a frown again. When he saw the man, Izuna ni, who had been carrying a pile of rocks for the campfire, dropped all of them. He dropped all the rocks on the ground, then picked one up and held it like a weapon in a defensive stance. The frightening man, who seemed to be oblivious to Izuna ni's behavior, remarked sharply, "What do you have to say for yourselves?" Izuna ni stated, "Unwritten shinobi rule number 1. He had mentioned the same thing to Uchiha Yashiro Yaji when he inquired about his grill. Rather from becoming more irate like the frightened man was, Yashiro Yaji had found it amusing. The frightening man approached the tent and stroked the lovely drawing that had been on the flap at the front of it, saying icily, "You were caught. And, that is my tent." The tent abruptly began folding itself up until it was as little as Gama-chan as the drawing glowed. The frightful man took up the tent, tucked it into a secret pocket, and turned to face them as it finished folding. Izuna looked at the area on the scary man's clothing where the tent had been concealed and remarked, "I have most definitely gotta get my hands on another one of those." The frightening guy took Izuna by the arm and declared, "The Hyuga do not abide thieves. Since there is no one to take care of you and correct you when you go astray, I will personally see to your punishment," he continued. Izuna struck the man's wrist with a rock to force him to release his grip, saying, "If you can't abide thieves, then what the heck are you guys ninja for?" Izuna raced to the frightening guy, grabbed his hand, and began dragging him away as he stated, "If you try to run, I'll just catch you again. I served as a Junin of the Leaf before I took my place as head of the Hyuga clan." After dropping his hand and pushing him behind him, Izuna assumed a highly stylish taijutsu stance. Izuna exclaimed, "Bring it, you inbred mutant," as his eyes became red and began to swirl with black. Izuna fell to the ground when the frightful guy brought it. Although he appeared to be dead, he was still breathing. It was nice that breathing humans were still alive. Most likely. Well, after giving it some thought, it wasn't that good. He was by himself in the woods with the irate, frightening man who was upset with them for taking his tent and likely even more upset with them for attempting to harm them. The large, menacing man lunged forward and seized him by the shirt before he could flee for assistance. He squirmed from his shirt and sprinted in the direction of the rock pile that Izuna had left behind. He was going to toss the rock he had picked up when the large, menacing man seized his arm and did something amusing to it that rendered it numb. Once more, the large, menacing figure attempted to seize him. He tried his hardest to defend himself, but the large, menacing man injured his other arm and legs, making it impossible for him to move. He attempted to bite his ankles, but the large, menacing guy grabbed him and Izuna and took them under each arm back to Konoha. With a paralyzed youngster under his left arm and an unconscious boy under his right, Hyuga Hiashi made his way to his clan compound. He had not intended to use the juken, even the less harmful kind used in spar training, on two young children. Thus his efforts to retrieve his clan's tent and provide well-earned punishment to the little brats in possession of it had not gone as planned. However, he had barely refrained from making the strikes deadly when a certain child had insulted him and his family, and he had caused more harm than he had meant. He had swiftly rendered the Uchiha lad unconscious during the fight in the woods, and given who he had allegedly been in his previous life, he was fairly taken aback by the child's lack of competence. He had been compelled to immobilize the Uzumaki youngster in order to transport him back to the hamlet after making the Uchiha comatose. The boy had drawn blood before being taken down, and his nails had resembled a pair of talons. He might use this as part of his lesson to teach the two lads he had captured why it is improper to steal from a Hyuga. When he arrived in Konoha proper on his route to his family compound, almost every inhabitant of the city paused to gaze at him and his cargo. The whispering had begun by the time he arrived in the market district. He had heard his name mentioned in a negative way a few times, but the most of the whispering had been about the lads and what mischief they must have gotten into this time, given the way they were being brought through the hamlet. He winced when he considered the rumors that would surely be spread about him because of this, especially since he had neglected to get the Uzumaki boy's shirt back and put it on him before he carried him back to town. After a prank in which he pursued his young clansman Obito halfway across Konoha, dragged his pants down, bent him over his knee, and spanked him, Uchiha Fugaku was still coping with the tales that had been generated 7 years earlier. The Hokage was standing there, waiting for him, when he arrived at the gate of the Hyuga clan compound. This encounter would not go well, judging by the frown that came to the man's face when he saw the Uzumaki infant, who was still attempting to bite his side with those keen tiny baby teeth of his. Not very well. Upon more reflection, he could say with certainty that his response to the theft of one of his clan's tents had not been very well considered. Izuna woke up with a sigh, quickly realizing that he was in a hospital. Like the medical tent in the Uchiha encampment and the infirmary back at the compound the Uchiha had owned before the founding of Konoha, the place he was in had the same smell of industrial-grade cleanser and medicine that he had encountered numerous times before, particularly after he had begun his active duty as a shinobi. He avoided both locations whenever he could because he had never been fond of them. Occasionally, he had foolishly tried to do so, but Madara eventually lost patience and hauled him in with an injury that was either bleeding excessively or had become infected. He did not know if the people here would be like the fine old lady who had run the infirmary when he was a child, or the grim and very strict man who had little patience for malingerers, and had run the medical tent with an iron fist and a barking voice that frequently cut through his patient's fitful and much-needed slumber. With the exception of him and Naruto, he was leaning toward a kind elderly lady toward every child that passed through. Almost no one was fair or nice to him or Naruto, and the majority of those that were to Naruto did not feel the same way about him. In this town, he was never able to get a break. If it wasn't the people who believed he was evil for resurrecting from the dead, regardless of how reluctant he was to do so, it was the people who believed he was an adult and ought to behave as such, avoiding small children, even if they were more mentally mature than the adults in Konoha. He was a nasty old pervert who was shackled in servitude to Naruto, according to the reports that had been circulating the town almost since the day he had arrived in the arms of a group of ninja. He was as widely despised as the little gregarious, eager, and always eager to please blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and incredibly lovable brat he'd adopted as his little brother because of those wonderful rumors, even though he couldn't sit still and pay attention for more than 2 minutes and had a penchant for pulling practical jokes. He was by no means Naruto's servant, even though he did the majority of the labor around the flat. Naruto had a number of his own errands to undertake, and his duties grew as he gained proficiency in more domestic duties. At the moment, the boy's ability to clean up after himself when he made a mess and correctly set out and put away his futon was about the best he could expect for. The child was terrible at general housekeeping, terrible at cooking, and terrible at cleaning. A nurse entered the room as his eyes were scanning his surroundings, which were very sparse, after he had completely awakened due to his growing annoyance at the circumstances. The nurse scowled down at him and questioned icily, "Awake are you? It's just as well, since you have a visitor. He's an important man, and I don't want you wasting too much more of his time. You've wasted enough of it while you were asleep." The Hyuga who had returned with his tent entered the room a minute after the nurse had left to tell his visitor that he was awake. The man's 2 black eyes gave him the appearance of a grumpy panda. He did not, however, comment. The Hyuga could harbor resentment for as long as their Uchiha relatives, and they were almost as proud. The last thing he needed was for the Hyuga clan as a whole to become even more hostile toward him. The Uchiha were not descended from the Hyuga, despite what many people think. There had been another, less well-known splintering of brothers among the descendants of the elder son a few generations after the one between the sons of the Sage of the Six Paths. The brothers had broken up when one of the men married his niece, according to the tale he had heard around the campfire after one of his cousins had a fight with a group of Hyuga and had a little too much to drink. The Hyuga were the descendants of the brother who had married his niece. Although the Uchiha and Hyuga were somewhat inbred to maintain their Kekkei Genkai, the Uchiha only crossed the line at first cousins, and even then, these unions were uncommon and unpopular. However, he had heard that the Hyuga had a number of brother-sister marriages, and he wouldn't have been shocked if the parents of the present Hyuga clan head had been one of them. After entering the room completely and shutting the door, the man remarked stiffly, "The Hokage ordered me to apologize for my actions." There was almost a minute of stillness before he asked, "And?" Before turning to go, the Hyuga remarked, "I apologize for my actions yesterday. Such unforgivable behavior won't happen again." Including the apologies from after Madara had taken his bedroll out onto the snow because he had grown weary of his snoring and almost passed away from hypothermia in his sleep. That had to be the most fake apology he had ever received. He yelled, "Say hello to Aunt Ma and Uncle Pa for me," to the person leaving his room as he closed the door. The man had clearly hit a raw nerve because of the way he stiffened at his remark. Fantastic. If only he could find anything else to do till he was out of this pit of misery. He was avoiding the television and its remote control, which was fortunate because it appeared the nurse had disconnected it when she was last here. This was not because he was wary of electricity. The Uzumaki child and the Uchiha boy, whose clan refused to claim him, were so different from one another that Hyuga Hiashi found himself spending a lot more time in the second hospital room he had visited that day after apologizing to the Uzumaki child. The Uzumaki youngster had looked at him with fear, while the Uchiha who had stolen his clan's goods had gazed at him with delighted contempt. The Uzumaki youngster took his apologies at face value and remained silent about his ancestry, in contrast to the Uchiha child who rejected it and hurled ancient clan history that was best left forgotten in his face. He had discovered that the Uzumaki child's bedtime water pitcher was entirely empty just as he was about to depart after the apologies. When examined more closely, it had also turned out to be bone dry. Without thinking, he had picked it up, filled it, and given the child a Euro, who had clearly been thirsty a drink of water. Because of what he had heard about the Uzumaki, he had assumed that he was a rude, ungrateful, and ill-mannered little brat who would waste any courtesy, so he was shocked to see the expression of enormous gratitude he had received for such a modest service. The boy, who was only a few months older than Hinata, had not been fed since the Uchiha child had fed him lunch the previous day. It was discovered after some asking about when the water pitcher had last been filled. It seems that someone forgotten to bring the youngster his breakfast when he arrived at the hospital, where he had been kept overnight for observation while his brother healed in the adjacent ward. The boy had arrived too late for dinner. As a result, he placed an order for the child's food and stayed to ensure its delivery. The Uzumaki could obviously take care of himself, but the Uchiha could not. Mizuki would have punched their lights out before they were committed if someone had just informed him that he would be visiting the demon at the hospital the week prior. The Uchiha had informed him that the demon was only a child, and the demon's attempt to console him the previous day in a very immature way, as well as the fact that it had been brought down by a Hyuga who was in no way comparable to the Yondaime and taken to the hospital, suggested that this was the case. No one wanted to conduct missions with him because of the stories circulating among the shinobi ranks, and he had nothing else to do that day, so he had plenty of free time to visit the hospital and make sure the demon wasn't there merely to torture patients who were dying. The demon had been hopping on the bed like any other bored youngster who had been left unattended during nap time when he arrived at his room. He managed to get the demon to stop jumping so that it wouldn't break the bed or himself, and he ended up spending 30 minutes with the demon, listening to him talk endlessly about Hyuga-sama, who had given him a plate of food and a pitcher of water, how he wasn't particularly frightening, and how he was glad to have another guest. The Uchiha were correct. The Yondaime had miraculously turned a huge, raging demon that had done all in its power to destroy Konoha into a regular kid. Izuna was so bored that he almost burst into tears, but he tried his hardest to look happy and smile for Naruto's sake. He and Naruto were among the new students who were welcomed to the academy today, along with several other children born to the leaders of several significant clans in Konoha, including Sasuke, the second son of Uchiha Fugaku. As was often the case after almost every war, there had been a huge baby boom in the years immediately following the Third Shinobi World War, so it wasn't all that strange that a disproportionate number of the children starting this year were clan heirs. Luckily, he and Naruto would be in a different class and would not have to deal with the brat from the Uchiha head. Although he had never met the child in person, he had heard that the entire clan had lavished the boy with attention. Uchiha Yashira and Mizuki were standing among the friends and family who had come to wish Naruto luck. After meeting Naruto almost 2 years ago, the two men who weren't very popular in the village for different reasons had come to like him a little. Mizuki had assumed the role of Naruto's much older brother, while Yashira had assumed the role of a surrogate uncle to both him and Naruto. Since the man had consistently belittled him in vain attempts to become Naruto's favorite brother, there had been some tension between him and Mizuki, who wasn't quite as accepting of him. The other man's rejection of him didn't hurt as much as it could have because he didn't really care for Mizuki himself. Even though the rejection from his old clan was much more painful, he chose not to let it affect him. It wasn't as though he had died for the same clan because he hadn't known any of them the last time he was alive. All four of them were, in a sense, outcasts. Mizuki because it was widely believed that he had killed a teammate on purpose during a mission. Yashira because he was a member of the Uchiha family, who had lost the village's favor because the villagers believed they were responsible for the Kyuubi attack, himself because he had been dead for several decades before being brought back to life through mysterious and possibly rather heinous means, and Naruto because, well, he wasn't quite sure why Naruto was considered an outcast, but the word, demon, had something to do with it. Although Mizuki and Yashira had appeared that day and stayed for a while, it wasn't as though they had united to form a single, contented family, as such a group would in some of the sappy children's books he had read in recent years. Despite playing the part of uncle, Yashira didn't visit very often, and it was obvious that the man had no plans to adopt either him or Naruto. Although Mizuki played the part of older brother, for Naruto, the man was frequently far too busy to spend much time with the boy. Like the majority of the village shinobi, the scarred man who was quickly becoming Mizuki's only friend appeared to be unsure about Naruto and had frequently attempted to divert Mizuki's focus from him. The only people in the group who were truly as close as brothers were him and Naruto. As he grew closer to becoming the adult he had been, he began to play a role more akin to parent, as memories of his previous life came flooding back, widening the gap between their mental ages. Both Mizuki and Yashira, however, had at least tried to attend the important events, which was more than most of the villagers did. Naruto might have gone insane from the near-complete seclusion if the three of them hadn't been present. He was already too hungry for attention. After what seemed like an eternity, during which several egotistical blowhards spoke, the opening ceremony for the year came to an end, and they were told to report for their first day of classes the following day. It was evident from the looks on his and Naruto's new instructors' faces that they were hoping the two of them wouldn't be present with the other students the next morning. However, they arrived, much to the dismay of their new instructor. He was positive that the opening ceremony had only served as a preview of the level of boredom and discomfort he would endure over the next, however many, years, based on his experience on the first day. As soon as roll was called, the instructor began a dull lecture about what it meant to be a ninja serving Konoha. It was filled with the kind of propaganda that organizations use to ensure the allegiance of their members. The instructor asked the kids if they had any prior experience with the ninja arts after the opening speech, which had been simplified for the young children, ages 6 and 7, who had no idea that they had been drafted into the army. The majority of the class raised their hands, as was to be expected. As was pretty much standard procedure in Konoha, the teacher then began asking each student about their experience, starting with the kids from the most prominent clans that the mediocre ninja had been entrusted with. These kids weren't that important because the kids from the prestigious clans had been placed in a different homeroom class. He and Naruto were completely ignored. Like the majority of the class, he was physically 7 years old, but his mental age was closer to 15, which made the entire experience mind-numbingly dull and even painful. After he, Naruto, and the civilian-born brats had finished showcasing themselves, he muttered, "Every last one of those brats forgot to mention the physical training they've been undergoing practically since the day they started walking, the civilian-born included." By the time he had reached their age the last time, he had accomplished more and experienced far more than those brats had. His generation's Uchiha children all had. According to the instructor, physical training. The games most of the kids play around here: hide and seek, top of the hill, tree flag, don't touch the sand, ninja, sparrow counting. "I can't believe the kids play that game," he replied. The instructor questioned, "Can't believe they play what game?" He answered, "Sparrow counting. The point scale is identical to the one they used to use for keeping count, they just repurposed the points values and scores." The instructor appeared taken aback upon hearing this. He understood why. Throughout their careers, some ninja engaged in keeping count to record their kills, which included extremely challenging missions and severe property damage, among other things. Depending on the kill's skill ranking, the quantity of property destroyed, or the difficulty of destroying it, a specific point value was assigned. It wasn't really a game, but some people treated it like one. "Back before you know what happened, me and my brother were forced to rescale the points value when our scores started getting ridiculously high," he explained. When they began tabulating the scores, even Madarani, who had previously treated it more like a game than he did, objected to the results. With an interested expression, the instructor inquired, "What scale did you use?" It would appear that the instructor was one of the few ninja who continued to keep count. Half point for animals that don't go in the dinner pot, 1 for CIVS, 2 for what you now call Genin, 5 for those who were at about Chunin level, 10 for those at Junin level, 25 for those who were at the level you'd refer to as Cage. The property destruction scale didn't start until at least an acre was burned unless there were occupied houses on it. He replied. "What was your score?" the instructor inquired, seemingly wishing to contrast the score he had achieved in his former life with whatever pitiful score he had achieved prior to leaving active field assignments. A score that he wished he had forgotten to compute in the days leading up to his death when he had mentioned that pointless game. "Dunno. I quit keeping track after it hit 5 digits. He responded. It was accurate. He hadn't even been 25 when the score reached that high, so it was too depressing. When he calculated his lifetime score using his and Madarani's scale and reached a 5-digit score, he recalled wondering if that was all his life had been about. That score included a startlingly high proportion of civilians, along with their homes, possessions, and pets, who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Although he had grown up during a period of almost constant conflict, that wasn't really an excuse. His response caused the instructor to quickly go pale. After a minute of silence, the instructor asked, "What are you doing here?" "Aside from the fact that I'm expected to join Konoha's ninja forces in repayment for all of the nice things Konoha has given me, and it's easier to join Konoha's forces when one's been through the academy," He replied, "I'm here because I'm sure that some things have changed, and a number of advancements have been made in the ninja arts since the last time around. I'm also here for Naruto." The instructor's expression changed from one of disgust to a mixture of fear. Even though Naruto raised his hand each time he asked an academic question and knew the answers to all of them, the man ignored him and Naruto for the remainder of the class. He realized early in the day that the instructor didn't want him and Naruto in his class and was prepared to go to any lengths, short of attempted murder, to get them out. When they arrived back at the academy early the following day, they found that they had been moved to a second-year class. Being promoted so fast would have been an honor for most people. However, he knew it wasn't intended as an honor, so he wasn't. The instructors were attempting to get rid of him and Naruto by graduating them early, which was the only way they could do so without being expelled, so they had given them an extra grade. As he smashed through the assigned work, he concluded that he would need to go over the first year's curriculum to make sure he and Naruto wouldn't be missing anything because they were progressing too fast. Despite his minor attention span issue, Naruto wasn't too concerned about falling behind because he could complete the second-year curriculum, or at least the material that the instructors had covered that day. Naruto did his best on the test the instructor gave him at the end of his first week of classes at the academy, despite the fact that he was extremely nervous and that many of the questions were difficult, leaving him unsure of his knowledge of the answers. Izuna was unable to attend school today due to illness and the need to be taken to the hospital for the removal of his appendix, so he didn't want to fail and be placed in a lower class. Izuna had declared himself satisfied when he demonstrated that he could read hiragana at a level that was acceptable for admission to the academy, but he was a little hesitant on the kanji that were in the test questions because he hadn't been inclined to sit still during the reading lessons that Izuna had given him over the years. Nevertheless, he believed he could understand the main idea of the questions and tried to answer them appropriately, even though they were challenging. After completing the final question, he anxiously observed the instructor's face change as the woman took his written exam and began marking it. It was clear that he had passed when she returned it. Seldom, after the written exam, the teachers took him to the training field where the important first-year students were learning how to throw kunai. Shortly after his discharge from the hospital following the tent incident when he was 5 years old, Izuna began teaching him how to do that, and he was fairly proficient. But Izuna, who was always talking about how he needed to get back in shape, was far superior to him. The instructor gave him multiple kunai and instructed him to hurl them at the targets that were laid out for the students as soon as he was positioned in front of them. He was fortunate to get 3 bullseyes, 4 more that ended up close to the center of their targets, and 3 more that hit the targets but not close to the center. Evidently, the instructor had given him another test or a portion of it, and he had passed this section as well, albeit narrowly. The instructor took him for a private taijutsu lesson after he threw kunai. Their instructor had dragged the other children who had attempted to observe from outside the sparring ring inside. When they played together at the orphanage, Izuna taught him some basic fighting techniques and taught him some tricks to use against the Hyuga so they wouldn't put him in the hospital again, as they had done after the tent incident a long time ago, where he had first met Hyuga-sama, who had been quite friendly despite his frightening appearance and initial behavior. He had also learned some moves from Yashiro Oyaji and Mizuki, who aspired to be a Junin instructor in the future. The instructor began writing something on a clipboard after their training session. He had not only met but surpassed her expectations, based on the expression on her face during the spar. As she wrote, she had made reference to a man named Itachi, and he could tell it meant something positive based on the way she compared him. She showed him his score once she was done writing. It was a good one. When she was done displaying his score, she led him back inside, where he was instructed to perform the 3 fundamental academy ninjutsu by another instructor. After classes ended, Izuna told him why he had laughed about those ninjutsu when their instructor had first introduced them on their second day here. In order to make it easier for the children of the Uchiha clan to flee in the event of a fight while they were nearby, the basic 3 were taught to them when Izuna was a child for the first time. However, he was terrible at the basic 3. According to Izuna, it was because he lacked control and had too much chakra. However, the old man had prohibited him from teaching him ninjutsu after he and Izuna had set the orphanage's roof on fire during a game of ninja, so Izuna did not demonstrate to him how to solve this issue. His attempt to perform the basic 3 was unsuccessful, just as it had been the day they were first introduced. But that was to be expected. So close was the sound of the instructor's groan as he slammed his head against the table in front of him. The first instructor, who had been quickly going through a book, prodded the man as he was telling him to leave and return to the class he and Izuna had with the older children, pointing to something printed on one of the pages. The man said, "Stay for a second. Is there any jutsu you can do?" Before demonstrating the wind jutsu Izuna had demonstrated to him, he said, "I can do one." The old man had advised him not to use it near a fire. When the jutsu was done, both of the instructors appeared a little taken aback and exhausted. As she picked up something from the table in front of her, the female instructor said, "Congratulations, Uzumaki Naruto. You have qualified for an early graduation from the academy. Of all of the academy students, you are amongst a rare few to have done so." The woman gave him a Hiashi and instructed him to register as a genin formally at the Hokage's office. Upon being given the Hiashi, he let out a loud cheer and proceeded to run through a group of students who were eating lunch on his way to the administrative complex. He encountered one of the Uchiha in his class while traveling at an extremely high speed and not paying close attention to his surroundings. His words were, "Sorry." And he continued. The older boy caught up to him and stood right in his path, drawing everyone's attention. "Where the hell do you think you're going, Pipsqueak?" he asked. With excitement, he responded, "I just graduated, and I'm on my way to register as a genin." The Uchiha boy questioned incredulously, "You, a genin?" He greeted the boy who was rudely obstructing his path with a cheerful, "Yep," and continued on his way to the office where he was expected to register. The boy grabbed him by the collar of his jacket after saying, "Yeah, right." His words were, "Let me go," as he attempted to distance himself from the Uchiha. "Make me," said the Uchiha. He was created by Naruto. In the teacher's break room back at the academy, a group of teachers were chatting quietly as they picked up their own lunches, which they would try to eat while gossiping and marking their students' work in the little time they had for lunch. When the two instructors who had given Naruto his early graduation exam entered the room and announced that the boy had passed, one of them remarked, "Well, I'm glad to see the back of him. I can't wait to get rid of the other one as soon as he gets out of the hospital." "So, how much did you have to pad his score?" inquired one of the professors. As she opened her bento, the instructor who had tested Naruto responded, "Had to pad the hell out of the written score, and had to use an obscure loophole to get him through the jutsu portion of the exam. Didn't have to so much on the physical stuff though. The kid doesn't know jack about the standard academy taijutsu form, but he's going to surprise the hell out of anyone who tries to pick on him. He fights like a drunken Uchiha who's been taught just about every dirty trick in the book." The woman's final words caused one of the instructors to wince. "Something wrong, Matsuda?" inquired one of the teachers. "Let's just say that I know from personal experience that a drunken Uchiha is one of the last things you'll ever want to run into, and can quite easily become the last thing you'll ever run into," Matsuda responded. At that point, a happy and helpful little boy interrupted the conversation. He wasn't feeling very happy right now, but he had decided that the best way to help his kinsman get out of the predicament he had put himself in was to get reinforcements. Everyone in the room turned to watch the young child scream, "Help!" as soon as the door had slammed open. Because she had a knack for working with kids, the instructor who had been assigned to oversee the more significant first years asked, "What is it, Sasuke-kun?" "Hideki picked a fight with the Uzumaki, and he's beating the crap out of him," replied Sasuke. Before leaving the room to be seen doing something, one of the instructors muttered, "Well, there went that plan." The Hokage had lectured them about how the Uzumaki should be treated before the school year began, and if they allowed the huge 12-year-old to beat the living daylights out of the 6-year-old boy, they would be reprimanded. However, Uzumaki was nowhere to be seen when they arrived at the location where the students had been eating lunch. Instead, they found Uchiha Hideki curled up on the ground, struggling to nurse a bloody nose while clutching his privates. "Where's Uzumaki?" inquired one of the teachers. The kids who had witnessed the altercation all pointed in the direction of the administration complex. As they watched a tiny patch of yellow vanish through a doorway, one of the instructors remarked, "Like I said earlier, I'm glad to see the back of him." Looking down at the documents his predecessor's son had just handed him, the Sandaime Hokage sighed. This was not the first time such an incident had occurred. It is highly likely that at least one of his own students, if not all three, were among the early graduates who were given the academy graduation exam in order to get rid of them. He couldn't simply send the student back to the academy and tell them to wait a few years, even though it never worked out well for them in the long run in their personal lives. He would be seriously harming the child's career in the long run if he did that, in addition to making the child a troublemaker as they attempted to prove they deserved the graduation. Almost never did students who were sent back to the academy after graduating make it past Chunin because their superiors were much less inclined to consider them for promotion because they assumed that there must be a problem with them. If he sent the child back to the academy now, he would never get to see the day when Minato and Kushina's son wore his hat. Up until now, he had never been happier that genin were assigned tasks better suited for academy students as missions. When he and his brother were organizing the ninja forces, his sensei apparently knew what he was doing when he established that small safety net. For young ninja who weren't yet prepared for the ninja life but would soon be able to hack it, such missions were ideal. He could keep Naruto training and on D ranks until he was prepared for the Chunin exams in roughly 3 to 5 years, but he couldn't remove the boy's headband without ruining his career. For Naruto, he had the ideal sensei in mind. He was fairly certain that he wouldn't turn Naruto down, and Danzo couldn't accuse him of giving the Uzumaki the short end of the stick because the young man, in addition to being one of the best ninja in the village, had been an extremely early graduate himself and had experience in that field. The young man had failed the genin team that had been offered to him this year and had politely declined the one that had been offered 6 months prior, when their sensei had died in a freak training accident. Why he would be entrusting Naruto to him would be questioned, but he could handle that when the time came. He was certain that Izuna would be graduating as soon as he left the hospital, so he thought the sensei he had in mind would be beneficial for Izuna as well. In this instance, he was less concerned about Izuna's well-being because the academy had not been a good fit for the boy who had the memory of a 15-year-old warrior who had already fought 100 battles and the impulse control of a small child. It would be best for him to graduate early, and since he also had the Sharingan, the sensei he had chosen would be in a better position to watch over him than the academy instructors. Finding a third team member would be the only task left. The academy instructors might notice this and graduate a throwaway student who was almost ready to graduate a little early, which would make that specific task a little easier, but it would be difficult because there were currently no spare genin to go around. He was fairly confident that, in the end, Naruto's circumstances would work out as well as they could for him, just as they had for his godfather, despite the numerous problems he knew the boy would face. He'd known for a while that Jiraiya had been a throwaway, but he'd never told the boy, and now look at him. In addition to being a living legend, he was also a well-known writer. As her younger son entered the room, Uchiha Makoto asked him, "How was your day at school, dear?" As he put his bag away, her son remarked, "It was awful. A 6-year-old from class 2 graduated, and Hideki decided to try picking on him. Then, Hideki yelled at me after I went and got the instructors to break up the fight, and called me a tattletale." Makoto hesitated, trying to take it all in. Class 1 students were the ones who graduated early in nearly all of the cases. Students who had not performed well on the entrance exam and were more likely to drop out before graduating were to be placed in class 2. She suspected that the child had been Sasuke, and it would seem that someone had been moved to class 2 for political reasons to make room for a less qualified member of a more prominent clan. The Hyuga heiress, who was rumored to be afraid of her own shadow, or him. Talented children from unimportant families, those without family, or those with foreign parents tend to get the short end of the stick. Unfortunately, clan politics had long since infiltrated the academy's very halls. Given that graduations at this time of year were practically unheard of, particularly when new students were involved, Makoto finally said, "It was nice of you to try to rescue a younger child from your cousin." She was determined to find out exactly who had graduated today. Hitaki Kakashi, who made history by graduating at age 5, had been a student at the academy since he was the same age at which a child in the general population would have started preschool. Hitaki Sakuma was perceived by some as having mistaken the academy for a preschool. Sasuke came into the kitchen and yelled, "I wasn't rescuing him from my cousin, I was rescuing my cousin from him." Makoto said, "Oh dear. This wasn't good." Since he wasn't the sharpest kunai in the holster and hadn't yet activated his Sharingan, Hideki had been having issues both at home and at the academy. Even if the child who beat him up had been a prodigy, something like this could ruin his future. Fugaku had a rough day at work because he was frowning when he arrived home in time for dinner hours later. He had always taken it personally when someone had gotten away with murder on his watch, and this one appeared to be one of those days. When the family was finally seated, Makoto inquired, "How was your day, dear?" Itachi was away on a mission. Fugaku made a face that was almost snarling, and from the way he held his chopsticks, he fervently hoped that they were a weapon with blades and that the person who was causing his mood was within striking distance. A Chunin could easily be killed by the amount of murderous intent he was displaying. But when he saw Sasuke's terrified face and realized that the poor kid was about to faint from the extreme of ki he had never seen before, he immediately checked himself. After being a little taken aback by her husband's response to her inquiry, Makoto said, "What's wrong, dear?" She hadn't seen him this angry since the clan was told they would be relocated to a district outside of town while Konoha was being rebuilt following the Kyuubi attack. That Uzumaki, Fugaku snarled after he eventually regained control. He wouldn't have graduated today if that abomination hadn't fed him all of the answers beforehand. That, and I couldn't charge him with attacking Hideki because he'd been in a legal gray area when he did so. As he wasn't registered as a genin yet, he couldn't be charged as a ninja, and since he had graduated the academy, he couldn't be charged as a civilian. The Hokage made me let the brat go, and I had Hideki's mother yelling at me the entire afternoon while the work kept piling up. This isn't the first time someone's gotten away with attacking a member of my clan, and if I have anything to say about it, it'll be the last. Sasuke, who was starting to get over his father's slight loss of control, said, "Hideki started that fight." "What did you say?" Fugaku turned to face his son, who appeared surprised that he had spoken up, particularly given his father's attitude. Sasuke, looking down at his rice anxiously, said, "Everyone saw the whole thing. The blonde kid was headed to the administration building when Hideki got in his way. He was terrified to break the bad news to his father. He tried to go around, but Hideki blocked his path again and grabbed him by his collar. The blonde kid asked him to let him go, and Hideki told him to make him. The blonde kid head-butted him in the nose, and kicked him in the balls before I went and got the instructors." Okay, that sounds like Kushina. Oh, Makoto thought. Like the rest of the clan, she had stayed as far away from the Uzumaki as possible to avoid accusations that they were trying to either sway the boy to their cause or keep him around so they could unleash the Kyuubi again. However, she had encountered the child a few times and discovered that, despite his coloring, he looked more like his mother than his father. Once before, she had also encountered the abomination, who lived with and cared for the Uzumaki child. She was reminded of her late grandfather by the boy who had once been a member of their clan. Izuna had reminded several other Uchiha who had encountered him of relatives who had been born before Konoha was established, so she wasn't the only one. The boy was much too old for his years, and she and the rest of the clan were all apprehensive about him because they had little doubt that the same person who had planned the Kyuubi attack had also planned his resurrection. However, since she was unable to care for Naruto, he was the one permitted to be close to him. After his son's brief revelation, there was a minute of gloomy silence before Fugaku finally sighed, "I will be having words with Hideki later. I had been led to believe that the attack had been unprovoked." A small group was secretly gathering in a dim corner of a remote area of Konoha, while the head of the Uchiha clan's family and the majority of the rest of the village, for that matter, were enjoying their evening meal. "We have rid ourselves of the Uzumaki, and shall soon rid ourselves of his companion. But, there is a small problem with our plan. All of the slots on the current genin teams are occupied, necessitating the passing of another to form a complete team in order to prevent their return." The group's leader stated, "Who shall be the third to round out the team?" One of the group members who hadn't been a big fan of his bright but spoiled and conceited student said, "How about that Hyuga kid?" The first person said, "Remember what team they will be on. It will not be an honor, and anyone who sees the team will notice this. It would be best to not anger one of the more powerful clans with the misplacement of one of their students." A young orphan would never understand how close he had come to escaping a life en route that day as the group began debating among themselves as they evaluated the merits or lack theory of their students and offered recommendations. Finally, a consensus was reached that was deemed acceptable by all members of the group. The child came from a strong clan, but the Uchiha were looked down upon by the village, and they could get away with it. Their brats had received years of training before beginning at the academy, which put them ahead of all the students who were born in the civilian world and even some of the students from ninja families. This was the only reason their brats were still in Class 1. The Hokage waited for someone in his office while the majority of the villagers were eating dinner and the instructors of the Konoha Ninja Academy were having their private meeting. "I apologize for being late, Hokage-sama." The Hokage's waiter said, "I'm sorry I'm late at last." With a scathing gesture, the Hokage killed the excuse the young man was making in his throat. The Hokage remarked, "I'm glad you could finally make it. There is a matter of importance that I wish to discuss with you." Without even a nervous tick to reveal the uneasiness radiating from him, the young man stood before him at attention. As the young man tensed up a little, the Hokage went on, "As you may or may not be aware, young Naruto has been graduated from the academy, and Izuna, and possibly a throwaway student will soon follow. I want to talk to you about the issue of their future training." Almost immediately after Yashiro Oyaji released him from lockup, Naruto headed down to the hospital, just before the dinner when the destiny of another academy student was decided. He had been in lockup because he had been arrested by one of the Uchiha for assaulting that Hideki child as soon as he had left the administration building. He was also given a ton of paperwork to complete with Izuna Ni's assistance and in order to come back to the mission assignment desk in a week to pick up his new sensei. He could have complained about how unfair that was until the cows returned home, but he didn't bother because no one would have cared except maybe Izuna Ni, possibly Mizuki Ni, and possibly Yashiro Oyaji, who for a variety of reasons couldn't really do anything about it. With sobbing, it was essentially the same. It was only under dire circumstances that he ever really did it around Izuna Ni. He had been in a cell at the police headquarters for a few hours until Yashiro Oyaji released him and warned him not to fight civilians anymore now that he was a ninja since he may be sent to jail for it if he hurt them enough. Since they were not yet a part of the ninja force, academy students apparently counted as civilians. He had been fortunate this time because he had only nearly been a genin when the brawl, which wasn't really that bad, started and the old man had stepped in. The police chief, whom he had first encountered when he attempted to replace the station coffee shortly after turning 5, wasn't pleased about being told to let him go and gave him a sour look as he was leaving. Even though he was extremely hungry from missing lunch, he immediately headed for the hospital after leaving the station, a little taken aback by the sheer number of Uchiha. He had never seen more than a few of them in one location before, as the station had been nearly deserted when he had attempted the coffee prank. Even though Izuna Ni would soon be leaving, he nevertheless made time to pay him a visit while he was there. Izuna Ni had informed him that since he had been hospitalized for more than a month after his appendix ruptured the last time, there must have been significant progress in shinobi medicine since his last visit. As long as he didn't overdo it, he would be able to join him at the academy on Monday, and this time it wasn't nearly as bad. The problem was that since he had already graduated from the academy, there would be no way to join him there on Monday. He was certain that Izuna Ni would be overjoyed to hear that he had already graduated after just 1 week and that he was so amazing. He hurried up to the room where Izuna Ni was staying as soon as he arrived at the hospital. Izuna Ni, who was leaning against a pillow and reading a book, remarked, "Hi Naruto. Did you steal Yashiro-san's Hitai-8 again?" He shook his head, blushing a little. After he had stolen his Hitai-8 while he was sleeping a few months prior, Yashiro Oyaji became irate, telling him that he would not be allowed to wear another one until he graduated from the academy, and made him swear not to steal anybody else's. "Nope," he exclaimed joyfully, "I got my own." "You what?" inquired Izuna Ni. He leapt to the edge of Izuna Ni's bed and cried with joy, "I graduated today." A number of nurses rushed into the room as Izuna Ni shouted, "You what?" while letting loose a bunch of that killing intent stuff. When his instructor singled him out early on Monday morning, before roll was even called, Uchiha Hideki swallowed uneasily. For him, the whole weekend had been a nightmare. He had repeatedly gotten away with making fun of small, clanless brats, but this time his bad karma had finally caught up with him and stung him in the butt. Apparently, he had chosen the wrong child this time, and even after the pounding was ended, he had to pay for it. He had gone to his mother after the brat had thrown him his ass and sent him home before lunch was even over. His mother was sure to start the process to get the child into the problems he had earned. Instead of being crushed under the Uchiha clan's force, the child had escaped unharmed, and the clan's might had been reversed against him. The head of the clan had spanked him himself and then made him listen to a lengthy lecture about proper behavior for Uchiha. He then spent the remainder of the weekend being disciplined by his mother, who grounded him for a month when he revealed that he had picked on other young children in addition to the genin, who had used a number of devious tactics to beat him. Since the incident had happened on school property, it appeared that the academy was punishing him because they had to deal with a disciplinary issue. His chances of becoming a ninja would be totally destroyed if they expelled him, which was even a possibility. He went to the room he had been told to go to and walked anxiously inside, dreading what was about to happen. In front of a table that another academy instructor was sat at, 2 desks had been jammed into the tiny space. A dark-haired youngster who appeared to be a Uchiha occupied one of the desks. Nevertheless, he wasn't a member of his clan because he hadn't seen the lad since he had appeared in his class in the middle of last week before becoming ill. He entered the room and was instructed to take a seat at the empty desk, where a pencil and piece of paper were placed. He and the non-Uchiha youngster were instructed to flip the papers over as soon as they were seated, and they were given an hour to do the test. Questions on the test paper covered everything from the history of Konoha to fundamental combat tactics, and nearly everything in between. Although he was able to answer the most of the questions, the test was more difficult than the pop quiz his teacher had given the class at the conclusion of last week to gauge their retention of the material. He and the stranger, who couldn't have been older than 6 or 7, were escorted out to the targets by the instructor after they turned in their tests, which were quickly marked and returned with a passing grade. The instructor gave them each 10 shuriken and 10 kunai. His tosses weren't his greatest throws since he was too preoccupied with trying to understand what was happening and anxious about it to pay enough attention. It was good that every weapon hit its targets. Each bullseye only had 5, which wasn't very excellent. Looking a little irritated, the child used both shuriken and kunai to bullseye all of his targets. The instructor took him to a training field for a spar after they had finished tossing weapons. Despite his best efforts, he ended up on his ass in less than 2 minutes because he was still preoccupied with wondering and concerned about what was happening. Now it was the turn of the other boy. He was unsure of the precise action taken by the child, but in a flash, the instructor was on the ground with a kunai to his throat. The child pinned the instructor in this position and then screamed in his ear, "You're lucky I don't want to bother with the hassle that will inevitably arise with your demise." The guy quickly went pale before being released. In front of the fairly pale-looking instructor and another who was presumably present as a witness or something, he felt a little unsteady himself when the rattled instructor led the two of them into a chamber where they were tested on the Fundamental 3 Academy Jutsu. They both passed this test with ease. The kid because he was reportedly a natural, like the blonde kid who he'd made the mistake of urinating off approximately 2 minutes after graduating, and him because he'd practiced them repeatedly for years until his mother was satisfied. One of the instructors at the table gave the two of them Hiashi and remarked, "Congratulations to the both of you. You are among a select few to have earned an early graduation from the academy." He looked up at the man who had handed him the headband after he had stared down at it. The man had a non-congratulatory look on his face. In addition, there was a problem with him taking the graduation exam months ahead of schedule when they could have simply waited until the end of the year to graduate him along with the rest of his class. Why hadn't they done it the year before or last year if they were going to graduate him early? Then it came to him abruptly. Instead of removing him, they had promoted him early because they wanted to get rid of him without disturbing his clan. This wasn't an honor. Rather, it was more retribution for what he had done at the end of the previous week, and if he could see it, then so would others. The young child with whom he had been tested responded, "Gee, thanks, nice to know I'm so welcome here." He took his Hiashi, put it in his pocket, and left. By the way, the both of you have something in common with the Shodai and Nadaime Hokages. Hashirama was a prat, and Tobarama was a total fucking jerk. Have a nice life. He wasn't the only one punished, it seems. So was the eerie youngster who had intimidated their teacher during the taijutsu section of the test. The young man left the Hokage's office and gazed down at the bells the Hokage had given him to use the following day. Once owned by the Nadaime, the bells were later passed down to the Sandaime, his students, and finally the Yondaime. Now, he has been granted permission to use them, even if just once. He was uncertain if he was prepared for this. He had absolutely no teaching experience and didn't believe he would be a very effective teacher. He had only been promoted 8 months prior, so he simply lacked experience. Since the academy's classrooms were still in operation, he took a deep breath and went into the mission assignment room where his new students were waiting. With looks that showed differing degrees of impatience, the 3 children waiting for him. One of them was a second cousin of his and towered over the other 2. One of them was almost 7 years old, while the other was both 7 and 28, and pushing a century. He said, "Good morning." To get the kids' attention. "I am Uchiha Shisui, and I'll be your instructor. If you pass my test, that is." Given that the collaboration test used to select passing teams for the Nadaime's teaching line was based on an ancient Senju custom, Uchiha Shisui's hands trembled a little as he grasped the bells that had once belonged to the Nadaime and may have been even older. He had tried to center himself by coming to one of his favorite spots, but it wasn't working out. He was anxious because in the morning he would find out if he would be in charge of instructing, leading, and looking after a group of genin. He wasn't really sure that he was prepared for this, though. Instead of serving as daycare providers, the majority of other Junin sensei had been Junin for years and were well past their adolescent years when they joined a team for the first time. Even though he hadn't felt prepared, he had harbored some modest aspirations to become a teacher, similar to what most Junin did when they were given a team to assess a few months prior. However, these aspirations had been dashed when the academy graduates to whom the Hokage had assigned him a Euro, likely with the expectation that they wouldn't pass a Euro, completely failed to understand the assignment's goal and couldn't be passed. When he had dismissed the 3 failing grads that day, he had primarily felt relief, even though their little hopes had been crushed. This time, though, he had 2/3 of a potentially outstanding team, and assuming Hideki wasn't totally terrible, a whole team. 2 of his prospective students had lived together since they were 3 years old, and since one of them had been raising and training the other like family, they should definitely work as a team. But Hideki a Euro, Hideki could have thrown a kink in his preparations. Should he truly wish to proceed with facing the team that was? With his palm still shaking, he proceeded to examine the little scratched bells that created a faint tinkling sound as he considered his alternatives for the upcoming ordeal, fully aware of what they stood for. Until now, the Nadime's teaching Linnea Euro, of which Senju Tobarama was not a member a Euro, was the only one allowed to use these specific bells, which had previously belonged to him. But he understood why the Hokage had given them to him for the exam tomorrow. He was the only non-Uchiha member of his team, which is why he had been given the bells to use even though he wasn't entitled to them. He understood exactly who the boy had belonged to and what the child would become in the future with the appropriate teachers. Would he be a suitable instructor for the Yondaime's son? Although many would disagree, he was aware of Naruto's rather obscure ancestry as he had seen the former Uzumaki making out with the Yondaime when he was younger. More than just making out, in fact, and it had almost permanently damaged him, especially after some hasty calculations a year later had strongly suggested that what he had unintentionally discovered while trekking had been Naruto's idea. Through him, the Uchiha clan had received a wonderful gift from the Hokage that was far more valuable than an additional parcel of land or a supposedly higher status in the community. Something that, regrettably, relatively few people acknowledged as valuable and never attempted to determine its actual value. Something he suspected Fugaku-sama would interpret as yet another insult and fail to see beneath the beneath, or even simply beneath on. He sat down on the branch next to his and was asked, "What have you got there?" By an exhausted Itachi who had just returned from a mission. He was either looking for consolation or advice that he didn't think he would receive from his father, who didn't seem to understand him and kept trying to push him to even greater heights, to shape him into the next Uchiha Madara in a time when a man like Madara wasn't needed. Like tiny Sasuke idolized Itachi himself, the younger youngster who had virtually idolized him as a child had once again managed to approach him covertly. This time, he used his seeming distraction as a justification for not hearing or sensing his cousin's approach. As he demonstrated the bells to his favorite relative, he responded, "I'm going to be testing a group of early graduates tomorrow." When Itachi saw them, his eyes grew wide. The Nadime's bells and the accompanying test were considered nearly legendary in some circles. Since his teacher had been a student of Jiraiya's along with the Yondaime, Itachi had previously seen them during his genin test. Sadly for his younger cousin, the guy had passed away in a tragic accident not long after Itachi had created Chunin, so he was no longer there for Itachi the way his former sensei had been for him. Itachi asked, "Who's on your team?" as he kept staring at the bells that seemed to be reminding him of the team he had essentially left behind in his quick ascent through the ranks of Anbu, where he was rapidly moving up even further even though he wasn't quite prepared for the responsibilities that were being placed on his tiny shoulders. "Hideki, Izuna, yes, that Izuna, and Uzumaki Naruto," he responded. After a long quiet, Itachi remarked, "I see." However, it was debatable what Itachi saw and how many layers he observed. Like most of the time, Itachi's face revealed nothing, demonstrating his intellect and skill at hiding his feelings and thoughts. The adage, "Still waters run deep," applied here. Itachi leaned back against the trunk of the tree that towered over the Hokage monument, where they were resting, unwinding, and looking down at the hamlet spread out below. "You should probably get some sleep, Shisui ni. You'll need to be well rested and on top of your game tomorrow. I've heard that the Uzumaki child has more energy than a daycare full of toddlers on sugar highs." The thought made him wince, but he followed Itachi's advice and leapt from the tree to descend into the settlement that the rest of their tribe had been discussing capturing for years and that he and Itachi would gladly sacrifice their lives to defend. He was still unsure of his feelings about the fact that the conversation had begun to take the shape of concrete plans and that he would eventually have to decide between the community and his family. He nodded once to Tekka, who was dashing across the roof of a nearby building on patrol, and he nodded back as he trekked through the largely silent streets on his way home. When he finally arrived at his home, he leapt to the window of his flat and crawled inside, where he prepared for and went to bed. His sleep was erratic because his thoughts were still racing. He woke up early the following morning to the sound of an alarm clock that was very loud and demanding. He changed into the typical Junin outfit, which he had worn perhaps 3 or 4 times since his promotion 8 months prior, and had a brief breakfast before heading to Training Ground 7, which was set aside for him for the remainder of the day. When he got there, his students were already waiting for him. Izuna was upset, while Naruto and Hideki also appeared anxious. Izuna and Naruto appeared to be rather well fed, which would cause a minor hiccup in the conventional preparations. He decided not to lose any more time, so he quickly explained the rules of the test to his prospective students and got things going. He was both praying and hoping that his time wouldn't be wasted this time, and he was worried about what would happen if it hadn't. Being a Junin instructor required a long-term commitment because, unless you were a total failure at teaching, you were typically in charge of your students for a minimum of 1 year. It was almost a given that you would return home in the evening during peacetime, and thankfully the work was generally safe enough to offset the drawbacks of being a teacher. After the guys dispersed, he began to move around the training grounds to keep an eye on them while they planned their attack and to avoid making himself an easy target. As he had anticipated, Hideki had gone off to pursue his own interests while Naruto and Izuna had stayed close to one another. As Uzumaki passed, Izuna was remarking to him in the bushes where they had concealed themselves at the beginning of the test, "It's a stupid teamwork test." From someplace to Izuna's left, the Uzumaki inquired, "How do you know that Nissan?" "Back before, when I was, well, you know, Madara and I may have run into a group of Senju during one of these little tests, killed the adult, and, taken the bells as a trophy. Madara used to keep them tied to his fan." Izuna responded. He pondered once more what he was getting himself into and if it would be worthwhile as he heard Izuna's narrative. Hideki was passable if one was prepared to work for it, but a bit below average for Uchiha. Apart from that one problem that caused him to be shunned by the community, Naruto was a decent enough boy who had a reputation for pulling fairly inventive practical jokes. As long as he could control the boy's prank-pulling tendencies enough that he wouldn't be fooled by them, it was acceptable. But Izuna was something else again, and he was starting to see why the clan was afraid of him. When Izuna was first living, he was known in the clan for being a decent man, a peace lover, and having a great heart. Following his passing, the legend of his older brother robbing him of his eyes and this reputation were passed down through the generations. The fact that the guy had slashed a bloody gash across the continent at Madara's side was thus mostly forgotten. It was unsettling to hear the child, who was only about 7 years old and held Izuna's soul, talk nonchalantly like an elderly campaigner to whom murder had long since become a habit. The boy went from being disconcerting to disturbing and possibly dangerous, as it was shown that he could and would kill like the old campaigner if he ever felt the need to. Before the allotted time had passed, Izuna and Naruto had both succeeded in persuading Hideki to cooperate with them after devising a scheme to steal the bells from him. Although Hideki's fear of Izuna and occasional hesitancy toward the Uzumaki child went against the purpose of the exercise, collaboration was what was required and demonstrated. With Izuna in charge, the 3 of them functioned as a cohesive team sufficiently that a power struggle between Hideki and Izuna was unlikely to cause problems into the road. He was still recovering from his appendectomy, so he considered himself lucky that Izuna hadn't been at full strength as he nursed the wounds he had sustained during the test. Given that he had dropped a chunin less than a day after being discharged from the hospital, who could have predicted what the child may have done to him if he had been playing at his best? Even though Hideki had been somewhat forced to work as a team, he passed his new squad, hoping and praying that he wasn't making a mistake. He then went back to the Hokage tower to register them and return the bells that weren't his. In order for him to try to evaluate precisely what had been provided to him, they would get together tomorrow to take their official team portrait and work out in the afternoon. It would not be quite as pleasant as it had appeared on paper, he suspected. When it came time for the official team photo, Naruto was feeling happier than Izuna. As the photo was taken, Naruto smiled, pleased to be a ninja at last, as it brought him one step closer to his objective. Izuna's arm was draped over his shoulders as the photographer took the picture, and he was grinning too, albeit not as broadly as he was. Hideki-san, the bully, stood somewhat to the side, appearing unhappy and not making contact with either of them. Standing firmly at attention behind them was their new sensei, Uchiha Shisui, who was dressed like the majority of Junin he had seen in the village. They were formally a team now that the photo had been taken. Following the photo session, there was paperwork to complete. Once Shisui-sensei completed the final forms and distributed copies of the team photo, they were excused from lunch and instructed to meet at the training ground that Shisui-sensei had set aside for them at 1400. In addition to being a special day, today was Ramen Day. He and Izuna would be combining their meager resources to get him half as much ramen as he could consume in a single sitting because it was Ramen Day. Izuna would get a bowl of his favorite ramen, a sushi order from a nearby restaurant, and a side order of a narazushi too. Izuna had explained to him that the reason he only ever ate sushi on special occasions was because, when he was a child, he could only get his favorite type of sushi close to the coast because it was very costly to ship the fish that went into it inland. Izuna always received the narazushi because it was his way of remembering his older brother Madara, who had loved it. Izuna would always give him the last piece of a narazushi after he finished eating on ramen days. Ichiraku's ramen would always be his favorite, but he enjoyed a narazushi, and receiving the final piece made it even more memorable because it linked him to someone who was very special to Izuna. Izuna description of the Madara impressed Naruto, who wished he could have met him. When the old man told him the tale of Konoha's founding and how Uchiha Madara had soon betrayed the village, he was far less frightening than the Madara he had described. Even though the Madara Izuna portrayed could be cruel at times, he would always make amends, always be there for you when you needed him, and go to great lengths to protect the people he loved. The old man had told of a bloodthirsty killer named Madara who had attempted to kill Senju Hashirama after becoming envious of his promotion to Shodai Hokage and stealing Izuna's eyes before he died and was brought back. Madara by Izuna was far superior. He was aware of how difficult Izuna's life was and how sad he was that his older brother and everything he had known before being pulled from the afterlife were long gone. As a result, he took part in Izuna's small customs and tried his best to lift his spirits and let him know that there were things in this place that could bring him joy. It was difficult to lift Izuna's spirits, though, because none of the other children in the village would play with them, and all of the adults gave them unsightly looks and called them Namesayuro, sometimes behind their backs, sometimes not. But because he had promised both Izuna and himself that he would always be there for him no matter what, he would never break that promise, so he would keep doing everything in his power to make Izuna happy. He would try his best to repay Izuna for having supported him for as long as he could remember. Baruka, a friend of Mizuki was eating his own lunch when he and Izuna arrived at Ichiraku's. For Mizuki sake, the man always tried to be courteous to him even though he didn't seem to care all that much. He sat down at a nearby stool and exclaimed, "Hi Yumino-san." With a smile. Nothing, in his opinion, could spoil the good day that was today. He felt that the man didn't exactly like him and was uneasy around him for an odd reason, even though it wasn't like he was being mean or anything. When he sat down, the man didn't give him the icy stare that most of the village's adults gave him, but he also didn't seem overjoyed to see him. Baruka greeted him, "Hello Naruto-kun." He then resumed his meal, attempting to ignore him as little as possible because Tsuki and his daughter Ayame, who was assisting her father today, were delighted to see him. As soon as Izuna was seated beside him, he said courteously, "Our usual please." Tsuki inquired, "What are you celebrating today?" "The last of the paperwork has been filled out, and Naruto and I are officially on a genin team," replied Izuna. Naruto thought it was cause for celebration, and I decided to oblige. "Really?" Tsuki said, with a startled expression. "I remember you two celebrating starting at the academy only a couple of weeks ago." For some odd reason, Izuna said sourly, "We graduated early." After a minute or so of silence, Tsuki said, "I see," before quickly shifting the topic. "So, who's your new sensei?" With delight, he exclaimed, "Uchiha Shisui." So far, he liked Shisui-sensei. Unlike most adults, the Uchiha did not glare at him. Tsuki began, sounding surprised, "That's funny, I would have thought that Hitachi," before suddenly clamming up and serving him and Izuna their first and only bowl of ramen. Ayame then went out to get Izuna his order of sushi and a narazushi. "Hitachi what?" inquired Izuna. Tsuki gave him an odd sidelong glance and said, "Nothing." Like all good things, lunch eventually came to an end, and it was time to report for training with Shisui sensei. The training session that day wasn't as successful as he had hoped. Izuna ni and that mean Hideki kid who had been placed on their team had aced every test that Shisui sensei had given them, including the taijutsu, ninjutsu, and genjutsu that they ought to have learned at the academy. But him. Shisui sensei halted their first spar almost immediately after it began, saying, "What the?" From his perch against a tree, Izuna ni remarked, "What did you expect? The Uzumaki have always been brawlers, it's like they're wired that way or something. Why do you think they went in for seals?" As Izuna ni occasionally did, Shisui sensei sighed, shook his head, and pinched the bridge of his nose after the cancelled spar before putting him to the test on the academy jutsu, beginning with the bunshin. He had stood anxiously for a minute after being instructed to perform a bunshin, trying to think of a way to avoid doing it. The one time he managed to get a bunshin to show up, it didn't look very good and died right away. He had taken his graduation exam at the time. He went through the hand seals in the hopes that it would work this time, but it became clear that he wouldn't be weaseling his way out of it. After he performed the hand seals and summoned the chakra required for the jutsu, a bunshin emerged. Like the last time, it appeared sick. Like the last time, it died instantly and vanished. Shisui sensei made his eyes have that Sharingan thing that all Uchiha have after it had disappeared like the last one he had made. He was then told to make another one. This one also had a sickly appearance, died, and vanished. After it disappeared, Shisui sensei muttered, looking and sounding shocked and dismayed, "He fried it. He fried it." Izuna ni called from where he had already taken out a book and begun reading, saying, "Not my fault. The Hokage forbade me from teaching him jutsu after we accidentally set the orphanage on fire." After the creation and death of the bunshin, Shisui sensei appeared confused for approximately a minute before he regained his composure and spun around to shout, "Chakra control exercises, now." Since he had never heard of them before or, if he had forgotten he asked, "What are those?" With genuine curiosity. Shisui sensei buried his face in his hands and moaned. Having just returned from a mission that morning, Hokage Kakashi had spent several hours in front of the Kia Memorial honoring the fallen. As he had done almost every day, he wasn't on a mission after that. Having nothing better to do that afternoon, he had made the decision to cut through a number of training grounds on his way back to the apartment he called home. When he was heading home this way, he occasionally heard one of his coworkers call out for him to join them in their training, and if he felt like it, he might. Almost everyone who hadn't served with him more than once or twice was too scared of him to say much about the training sessions he interrupted by passing through them, and they hardly objected to the interruption of their training regimen. He sliced through a training ground that was populated by what appeared to be a genin team on this particular day. But it wasn't any team he recognized, and like any good ninja, he was familiar with every team that had played this year and the previous year. A group of children, two of whom appeared to be old enough to know better, were apparently playing in inappropriate places. He caught the group's attention by shushing up next to a young man playing, Sensei, who he vaguely recognized from behind as either a chunin or a recently promoted junin. "So, playing ninja are we?" he asked. Uchiha Shisui, dressed more like a Konoha shinobi than his usual Uchiha attire, responded icily, "There's no playing about it, Hitachi. Hokage-sama entrusted me with a team of early graduates." His gaze shifted between the young Uchiha, who appeared to be about the typical academy graduation age, and the young boy he would have known anywhere because he would be wherever Naruto was. Given that Uchiha made up 2/3 of the team, it was expected that Shisui would be placed in charge of it. His gaze then wandered to the little blonde who was dangling from a tree branch without any conscious effort on his part, and as he recognized who it was, a fierce sense of rage surged inside of him. Naruto was the kid who was playing in the tree. Naruto, who should have been his. He had promised Minato sensei that he would train his unborn child back before the Kyuubi attack, in the interim between Rin's and Minato sensei's deaths. He had no intention of breaking that promise. Even though he had avoided the boy whenever he was in the area for the past few years and occasionally accused him of being responsible for the deaths of Kushina-san and Minato sensei, it didn't matter that he could hardly bear to look at him because he was a painful reminder of his loss. When he, Minato sensei, and Kushina-san were having lunch at Ichiraku's 3 weeks prior to the end, he had sat at the counter and made a vow to Minato sensei that he would train Naruto, and he was going to follow through on that promise no matter what. The Hokage had no right to give Naruto away, and if it were his last act, he would retrieve him. He didn't even realize that he was releasing killing intent, much less the substantial amount that he was, as he stood there murderously enraged that Shisui had been given something that he had no right to take. It was only when he felt a live kunai being pressed against his throat that he regained consciousness. When he did, his first impression was that the angle was oddly off and that he could feel 2 feet using chakra to grip the back of his vest. A rather irate Uchiha Shisui, holding the kunai in his own hand and his Sharingan active, said, "Izuna, let him go. I'd let you do it, if I could, but there are too many witnesses who'll twist the story around to suit their own agendas about." Both the pressure from the kunai and the pressure from a pair of tiny feet on and in his back disappeared, and he heard a faint thump behind him as his would-be assailant landed a euro, likely on his feet, judging by the sound. Shisui put his own weapon away and said icily, "You'd better be going now, Hitachi. And, if you think you can threaten one of my students, well, let's just say that I have a number of friends on the police force that would also be glad to see you gone." He responded, "That wasn't meant for Naruto, who, by the way, does not belong to you," after realizing that he had been releasing a lot of killing intent in his rage. He hurried out of the area before something irrevocable happened after realizing the situation he was in and the consequences of killing Shisui as he currently desired. It is likely that Naruto would not be pleased with him if he killed his future ex-sensei in front of him. Izuna growled while removing yet another weed from a civilian woman's garden. In addition to the traditional lessons on which plants were edible and which weren't, an older cousin of his and Madara niece had taught them some herb lore when they were young. This was just another medicinal plant that was being wasted because it didn't look as lovely as the rose bushes the woman was growing or what would be planted on the empty plot of land that Naruto and Hideki were weeding come spring. If properly prepared, the roots of this specific plant were effective in lowering fevers in young children. Because they prevented infection, the plants Naruto and Hideki were pulling up were traditionally applied as poultices to battlefield wounds. Since he had turned into a genin a week earlier, this was his 3rd D-rank mission, and it was as awful as the previous 2. Since autumn had begun, it was time to send out genin teams to do various tasks, like raking leaves and pulling weeds in preparation for spring, which is what he and his team were doing right now. Cleaning leaves and other debris out of fountains in one of the village's many parks a euro, which would only be refilled with litter in a few days a euro, had been his first D rank. The trash-filled stone monstrosities, remnants of a style he'd been happy to miss, had been in one of the shabby parks in one of the worst districts of Konoha, and he had the impression that the men who were in charge of assigning missions had chosen the dirtiest fountains for his team to clean out. He suspected that the bushes in the nearby park were home to a homeless encampment, and the dilapidated objects that had been filled with standing water smelled as though they had been used as toilets rather than fountains for the previous few decades or so. Although the second mission had been less filthy than the first, it had still involved a lot of backbreaking and tiresome work, and he had a hunch that Shisui had paid him for the yard work the team had completed at the home of the Uchiha clan head 3 days prior. When he had asked the team for that specific mission, he had no illusions that Fugaku wasn't trying to correct him and rub his nose in the fact that he was no longer co-head of the Uchiha clan. Every time they had met, the man had said a variety of things along those lines. The knowledge of the origins of this specific tradition of initiating the newbies was more annoying than the degrading and tedious chores and other menial tasks that made up D-rank missions. The Senju had used tasks like this and referred to them as missions to divert the children from possible conflict situations by sending them on pointless missions that the paying civilians could have completed on their own. Notwithstanding the fact that the Senju were all but extinct, that should be expected given that the Senju philosophy and methods of operation dominated the village. The entire village was essentially a Senju camp where he was confined because he had nowhere else to go, though there were a few Uchiha customs thrown in for flavor. Naruto appeared to be fairly content with the state of affairs, in contrast to his own depressing state. However, as long as you asked politely, Naruto would be content if you abandoned him in the snow and told him to hike 1,000 miles. Hell, even the slightest act of kindness from someone in hell would make Naruto happy. But he wasn't nearly as content with the predicament he knew he was in. He was aware that he was trapped here if he didn't want people to try to find him for the rest of his life or to try to capture him so they could force him to breed Uchiha for their village, even though he usually didn't show that he knew. Particularly because, although he possessed the knowledge of someone at roughly Junin level at the moment, he lacked the corresponding physical strength, muscle memory, and even chakra reserves. At best, he could use some old tricks that had become obsolete over the years to surprise a few Chunin or especially non-observant Junin. Despite its cheerful exterior, Konoha had a dark side that would not hesitate to engulf him if he crossed too many boundaries. He vividly recalled being taken to the T&I department for questioning, among other things, even though his recollections of his arrival in Konoha were hazy in comparison to the memories of his past lifetime, which continued to surface at random as he connected something he was going through with something that had happened in his past. At the time, he was unable to comprehend why it was happening to him, but now he could guess with ease. Naruto was at the center of it all. It had taken him years to piece things together because he had never been overly concerned about it before and hadn't paid much attention to Konoha's recent history when he read, because he had always liked adventure stories over more scholarly literature, and the adventure stories he had read were typically set either around the village's founding or, if they had a historical setting, during one of the many wars. And only after he had been compelled to concentrate on the village's more recent past, as an academy graduate, had to be aware of it. It would have likely taken longer or not been completed at all if he hadn't made the decision to study the academy curriculum in his spare time in order to ensure that he and Naruto wouldn't miss anything because of their early graduations. What do you get when you combine Uzumaki sealing abilities with a Biju attack? Uzumaki Naruto, please respond. Because they were unwanted due to circumstances beyond their control and because the orphanage didn't want them to interact with the other kids living there at the time, they had put them both in the same room. The other boy was viewed as unlovable by the orphanage staff, so they hadn't really expected him to develop a bond with him. But that was what the Hokage had been counting on. Why, was the question. The Hokage was so protective of the boy that he sent a 3-year-old to the T&I department. Why would he do everything in his power to help them bond without being overtly obvious about it? Why was it that whenever he used his Sharingan near the boy or Yashura-san stopped by, the secret watcher Sayuro, of which neither he nor Naruto were supposed to be aware, Sayuro, went into high alert? For what reason was he connecting those two items? **T. Naturally. Madara ni, the Valley of the End, where Senju Hashirama's hand ultimately brought him down. The Kyuubi. This week marks the 7th anniversary of the Kyuubi's reappearance and rampage through Konoha. They believed Uchiha was to blame. The Hokage had hoped that Naruto would grow attached to the boy because they were anxious when he spent time with an older Uchiha. He would be less inclined to kill the child in order to free the beast, which he had only the haziest notions of how to control, if he was attached. As the Hokage had intended, he became attached to the boy, which was bad for him but good for Naruto's ongoing survival. But there was one thing the Hokage hadn't anticipated. Anyone who attempted to take Naruto away from him, even the Hokage himself, would pay a heavy price. Naruto was his. He had a fair amount of confidence that Naruto would pay if he couldn't. In relation to those who sought to remove his Naruto, the Hitachi was once more pursuing them. He had seen the man before the day he had appeared to almost kill Shisui because the teenager had been given Naruto as a student. Over the years, he had seen the man in the corner of his eye a few times, and each time it had been the same. The man would gaze at Naruto for a long time, but he would disappear if he ever drew Naruto closer to him. Shisui hadn't been marked down as a possible threat because Naruto hadn't seen him very often prior to being placed under Shisui. But now there was no doubt that the Hitachi was on the list. He had no idea why the man was so fixated on Naruto, but he was certain that it would not end well. With a sigh, he brought himself back to the present, tossed another Weeb onto the heap of discarded plants, and then got up to approach the man who was relaxing. He made no effort to hide his presence in any way, as though he didn't care who saw him. He made sure there was no mistaking who he was speaking to by saying, "You're unwanted here, so get lost." Datbane. When he was less than 3 feet from the man's one visible eye widened for an inexplicable reason, and the expression on what little of his face he could see was similar to the expressions he had seen on several other faces when that specific verbal tick slipped because he was excited, irritated, or stressed. He had no idea what it was about that tick that Naruto had noticed, but as a result, Tsuki, Fugaku, and a few other Sayuro, including that councilwoman Koharu Ayuro, had practically questioned him about what he remembered about his family. The Hitachi remarked, "She couldn't have. There was no time, and..." He exclaimed, "Whatever, get lost Ibane." Unexpectedly, rather than remaining to resent him as he had been doing lately, the Hitachi walked away, as if absorbed in his own little world, muttering about seals and how it was impossible because there had been no time. What is it with everybody, and that stupid verbal tick I've been trying to get rid of for 2 lifetimes now? He thought to himself, slipping from the dark corner where he had hidden himself, ready to leap in if the confrontation between him and the Hitachi had gotten nasty. Shisui remarked, "I always thought it was an Uzumaki thing." He inquired, "Uzumaki thing? Madara ni claims that his mother, from whom he had allegedly inherited the tick, had been a Uchiha. As the kunai he had been holding vanished into one of his many pockets, Shisui responded, "The habanero used to do it when she was upset or excited, which was practically all the time from what I remember." "The habanero?" he inquired, curious about the origin of that moniker. "It had to have been an absolute doozy." Shisui pointed at Naruto while making the mother hand sign. He inquired, "How do you know her?" Shisui hadn't been the woman's pupil, judging by the way he treated Naruto, and he appeared a little too young to have accompanied her on the battlefield in the previous conflict, assuming she had participated. As Shisui responded, he appeared to be concealing something, or at the very least holding something back. "I was a few years younger than her boyfriend's student who was a cousin of mine that I'd occasionally hang out with since he was one of the few members of the clan that still played ninja with the kids after he became a genin, despite the fact that he constantly got lectured about his disgraceful behavior over it." Finding it a little strange that he had never heard Naruto's parents mentioned by name before, even by the Hokage, he remarked, "Funny that you don't mention them by name, considering the fact that you knew them." Shisui made an ambiguous gesture toward the location where the Hitaki had left, saying, "You'll find that no one who knew them as his parents will, including Obito's former teammate. And, should you discover their names, you won't either." Happy that he had finally mastered the tree climbing exercise to a level that Shisui-sensei approved of, Naruto ascended the side of the apartment building he lived in and made his way to the window of the apartment he shared with Izuna at the end of yet another day of training and chores masquerading as missions. It felt nice to be commended for something he had done, and he hoped his sensei would give him plenty more in the future. Shisui-sensei liked him, which was a perk, and although being a ninja wasn't the best thing in the world, it wasn't the worst either. However, becoming a ninja wasn't enough for Izuna ni. Since turning into a ninja, Izuna ni had been utterly miserable, and his mood became worse every day. He had also witnessed Izuna ni give the Hokage monument a number of menacing glares. At last, Shisui-sensei advised him to refrain from doing so, particularly in public. Izuna ni, however, continued and did so when he was very certain Shisui-sensei wasn't watching. Perhaps the D-rank missions were the source of Izuna ni's discontent. But no matter how much he cried and pleaded, the old man refused to give them anything better. The fact that you don't begin by battling bandits and saving princesses on the first day had disappointed him personally. Since the missions were a step down for Izuna ni, who recalled battling bandits and saving princesses, it was likely more difficult for him to adapt. Many steps down. Izuna ni had not been particularly bothered by the D ranks, but they appeared to irritate him. There were other things besides the money he had been paid to make up for the awful chores, even though some people tried to make them more difficult for their team. When another genin team had gone to retrieve the bags they had forgotten and no one else was watching after they had finished with the fountains, Shisui-sensei had allowed him to jump on their leaf pile. Shisui-sensei's dislike of the other Junin was likely a contributing factor, but it had still been considerate of him to pull him from the mess he had created on the pile just before the other team returned rather than allowing him to be caught. The wife of the cruel police chief had also been kind. She would even give him a pair of winter gloves that her son Sasuke had outgrown and sneak him some hot tea while her husband wasn't looking. He was ready to jump in through the window when Izuna ni, who had arrived at the apartment before him using a shunshin, barked, "Shoes off before you enter the window." He was afforded an almost unmatched view of much of Konoha and the preparations being made for tomorrow while sitting on the windowsill and taking off his sandals. It was both his birthday and the 7th anniversary of the Kyuubi attack tomorrow. For the people of Konoha, the anniversary of the attack was a day of contemplation and recollection, and it was also the day of the year when the whispers and glares that were all about him were at their worst. He had no plans to go out because Shisui-sensei had given them tomorrow off. Besides, Izuna ni had a birthday celebration planned, so there was an excuse to remain in the apartment. Since he hadn't been able to locate Izuna ni's present hiding place this year like he had last year, he had no idea what Izuna had planned for tomorrow or what his present would be, but it was certain to be good. However, there was one thing that was tainting his forthcoming birthday's potential joy. He questioned, "Izuna ni, why are you unhappy?" As he observed the town being decked up in melancholy hues in anticipation of tomorrow's memorial service, which he and Izuna ni would be missing because of what had transpired the year before when they had gone for the first time. It hadn't been fun being screamed at by a furious drunk. He was starting to prepare dinner when Izuna ni sighed behind him. In exchange for Izuna ni using lights rather than candles, the old man had swapped out the electric stove for a gas one some time ago. Izuna had taken this to mean that he should turn on the lights when he heard the old man was nearby and conceal the candles when he paid him a visit. Izuna's strange behavior made sense, therefore he tolerated it. After hearing about the man who had been electrocuted while renovating his home, he could see why Izuna was terrified of the lights, the refrigerator, and the electric kettle that he had given to the orphanage as soon as the old man's back was turned, because it would have been a waste to throw it away. As he started the rice to boil over a ring of blue and yellow flames that he felt were more attractive than the coil things on the previous stove, Izuna finally spoke. It's a long story. Basically, it all boils down to the fact that the Hokages weren't and aren't the paragons of virtue that you've been raised to believe them to be, and the fact that if I value my life, I'm stuck here. He was scared and perplexed by Izuna's response. Izuna wanted to be here, didn't she? Was Izuna merely acting as though he liked him, or did he actually like him? Izuna would act as though she liked him, but why? Was he truly as unlovable as the matron from the orphanage claimed, or did anyone actually like him? Izuna approached Naruto and gave him a hug, saying, "It's not your fault, Naruto. None of it ever was." Without knowing what to say next, he began, but he couldn't decide which question to begin with because there were so many in his head. You've had enough blame for things you didn't do and things you had no control over heaped on your shoulders, and I won't be adding to it. Izuna continued to hug him. If you notice, most of the other Uchiha aren't happy here either. They know that they too are stuck here, and that the time when they could have left has long since passed. That's why they're planning something they know is suicide, because it's far better to die fighting than on one's knees. As for whether or not I'll join them when the time comes, I don't know. He asked, "What do you mean?" Since he didn't like the way Izuna was speaking. "It's a secret I can't share with you. If you know and don't tell, you could be put in prison or worse. If you do tell, a large number of people will die, including people you care about, and I don't want to put that on your shoulders on top of everything else," said Izuna. "I'm not the only one who is uncertain as to whether or not they want to go through with things though, so it may come to pass that passions will cool, plans will be shelved, and nothing will actually happen, especially if the Hokage makes a certain set of concessions that I've heard are in the works." He was ill. He simply knew that whatever Izuna was discussing was awful. Very, very horrible, and that if anyone found out that Izuna was involved, bad things would happen to him. After attempting to reassure Naruto and further upsetting the boy by talking much too much, Izuna snarled as he started to make dinner. Simply asking would have spared Naruto from burdening the youngster with concerns that shouldn't be placed on a child of that age. He most likely wouldn't have given any thought to what he was thinking about now 2 or even a year ago, since he was still stung by the rejection he had received from those who were meant to be his family. But given how he and the person he had adopted as family had been handled by the local. A few weeks prior, when Yashara had approached him with his doubts regarding the plans being made, he had told him everything. He needed an outside opinion and was unable to discuss what was happening with a real outsider who could betray his confidence and that of the rest of the clan. Since Madara was no longer with him, his only remaining blood relatives were the offspring of the men and women he had fought with during his previous existence. He still identified as a Uchiha, and as such, his first devotion was to the clan, even though the surviving members of the clan viewed him as an outsider. Even if he hated the current head of the clan, who was one of the primary motivators behind the plans, his initial allegiance was to the clan, which was his family and his blood, therefore what he was expected to do with regard to the plans that were in the works should have been obvious. He wasn't the only Uchiha who wasn't sure they would carry out the suicide call to attack, since they were caught between other commitments and their family's needs. He had witnessed the fear in Shisui's eyes as he watched his team practice, the concern in Makoto's as she strolled through the village with her younger son's hand in hers, and the fear in Yashara's eyes as he told him everything when he had come looking for answers. Although he didn't hold on to it too closely, he did harbor a glimmer of optimism that the situation would be resolved amicably and that the Uchiha would receive the equal share in the village that they had been promised at the founding. With the Hokage's ear being held by an unyielding bastard on one side and numerous grievances from the clan elders behind him being driven by an obstinate and conceited guy like Fugaku on the other, it was likely that things would reach a breaking point within a year or two. Like everyone else in the tribe, he was able to see it, and many of them were concerned, including himself. No matter what choice he made or whose side of the divide he fell on, he knew that he would need to prepare Naruto for what was about to happen. He would accomplish this, among other things, by revealing to Naruto the information about the senju that had been omitted from the history books in order to whitewash history and perhaps make the Uchiha appear worse in contrast. During the generations-long conflict between the clans, both sides had committed atrocities that would have sickened even the most ruthless ninjas. His own clan had likely seized the first opportunity for peace despite its hidden cost, since there had been enough bloodshed between the two clans for even the most aggressive members of each to become weary of war. 3 or 4 generations later, the Uchiha were now paying the consequences. Over the years, he had remembered several occurrences, but the one that had affected him the most was from his early childhood, when he and Madarani were still young. Since he had been sent home to recuperate from wounds he had received on the battlefield, his and Madarani's father had not been expected to fight that day. However, a senju force had flanked the ninja who had been guarding the compound they had been residing in at the time and began attacking the civilians who had been residing there directly. That day, many people died, the majority of them young children or the elderly, and the slaughter had set off the bloodiest clan warfare in many years. In order for Naruto to comprehend what was happening and how it had been simmering for generations waiting for something to cause it to boil over, he should tell him these things before the old man, who was attempting to instill the will of fire in the boy, gave him a heavily edited pro-senju version of them. Even though the winners wrote history, the resentment of the losing side did not just disappear. That was demonstrated by what the Uchiha clan was planned, which he might or might not take part in if it ever materialized. Food is just one of the numerous things that may bring people together. The way to a man's heart is through his stomach, as the adage goes. In this instance, Hideki's transformation from that unfortunate fool who ended up on a team with them to Naruto's friend, a well-known member of Izuna's family, and a comrade in both of their views, was brought about by a forgotten meal. But it wasn't Hideki who had brought the food. You see, Hideki's parents were both still active ninjas, even though they were both approaching the end of the typical life expectancy for such people. This is in contrast to Fugaku and Makoto, who had essentially settled down and stayed in the village with Makoto taking care of the house after getting married and starting a kid. Now that Hideki was a genin, they felt free to go on missions simultaneously, which allowed them to earn more money for their eventual retirement. Previously, they would arrange things so that one of them would be at home with the child while the other was away on a mission. Usually, that left Hideki, whom both of them considered a letdown, on his alone. In their opinion, Hideki was old enough to take care of himself now that he was a genin, and it wasn't as though he required their assistance with his training because, if one of the clan's best ninja couldn't assist him, then no one could. Hideki, who had had at least one parent look after him constantly for as long as he could remember, had little to no knowledge how to take care of himself, which was the issue with the decision his parents had taken without discussing him. Since cooking on anything other than an open fire was only discussed in the kunoichi lessons due to a mistake at the academy, he had no idea how to do it. But luckily for him, his mother had left some raw foods and leftovers in the refrigerator before she departed on her assignment, so he wouldn't go hungry before she or his father returned. On the day in question, Hideki had made himself lunch using the leftovers his mother had left in the refrigerator. However, he left it out on the counter when he realized he was running late and hurried out the door, making the lunch completely useless. Since he had woken up too late to make breakfast and had intended to use his lunch as a mix of both, Hideki, who had essentially never missed a meal in his life, started to experience what it was like to go without food for the remainder of that day. He had accepted rather than refused Naruto's customary invitation to dinner, which he had previously turned down with extreme prejudice every other time it had been made, because of that strange feeling of hunger that had been gnawing at his belly throughout the day's training and that day's sucky D rank that involved feeding some ill-tempered geese. He was quite anxious by the time dinnertime arrived since Izuna had given him enough friendly warnings about what would happen if he misbehaved that night to make a normal guy shudder. However, there was food, which was the most important thing to Hideki at the time because he had gone the entire day without eating, which meant that he was essentially starving to death for a modern Uchiha who had not yet been out in the field. In addition to the food, there had been conversation at first awkward, but as the evening wore on, it became more fluid. Understanding comes with dialogue. The crew had grown closer with comprehension. This would have been a good thing in any other case. But in this one, fate had only granted the group a few brief months of something resembling bliss before half of them passed away a few months before Naruto's 8th birthday. The end began when Shisui passed away. Hideki would never see Tobi, thus he would never know that the day Tobi appeared actually signaled the beginning of the end. Before he died, Hideki would only truly know that he hadn't been placed on such a poor team after all and that something was stirring in his clan. Toba's appearance had been a typical day. They had met at their regular training area after the sun had risen and they had prepared for the day. The squad came together, trained for a while in the morning, and in the afternoon, they took AD rank for the pay more than anything else. Naruto and Izuna returned to their flat to find a stranger waiting for them after the job, which had lasted longer than expected and ended well after nightfall, and the squad had been paid. Given some of Konoha's other unusual inhabitants, including one who went out just wearing a genjutsu instead of the one he had been born with decades earlier, the fact that the man had been wearing a mask had been strange, but not particularly strange. Although the long, spiky black hair had seemed somewhat familiar, it was too widespread among the many individuals in the community who wore theirs in too many different ways to allow for a sufficient identification of the intruder. But according to Izuna, the eyes had identified the man as a Uchiha, which was somewhat strange because he could immediately identify every member of the Uchiha clan, and the man seated on the dresser wasn't one of them. Being the bold and gregarious youngster that he was, Naruto had been the one to inquire about the stranger's identity and purpose. The man had attempted to pass himself off as Madara rather than provide an honest response, but Izuna called him out on it right away because he still had large portions of his memory missing. There had been something slightly off about the man's posture, aside from the fact that his hair was incorrect. When Izuna confronted the man about his deception, he responded, "I am Madara-sama's representative in this world until his resurrection, so, for all intents and purposes, I am Madara-sama. You may call me Toby, however." Since there were several safeguards on the apartment and in the neighborhood that the boy was largely ignorant of and which had previously kept all possible threats out, Naruto asked again, curiosity rather than alarm, "Why are you here?" No one who had wished either of them harm had ever entered the apartment before. The man's eyes never left Izuna as he said, "I am here because I was curious." While Izuna continued to assess the situation, uncertain of what was happening but feeling that the man who had broken into their flat was hazardous, Naruto asked the stranger who had invaded his and Izuna's personal space, curious. "I knew that Madara-sama had been up to something near the end." The individual said, "But, I had never suspected him of such sentimentality." The man, who had been sitting on the dresser, had finished answering Naruto's inquiries and moved out of the apartment. Izuna wanted the man gone, and as soon as possible, so instead of blocking his route, he moved out of the way. As the man made his way to the door, Izuna inquired, "Has your curiosity been satisfied?" As he left, the man said over his shoulder, "I've never known Madara-sama to do something without reason. You're obviously meant to serve some purpose, whether or not that purpose is the same one that you originally served remains to be seen. Either way, you can count yourself lucky because you're off the list." As the apartment's door closed behind the intruder, Naruto questioned, "List?" Izuna answered, "Don't know, don't care." She then threw out all of the food in the flat and tossed the place for any surprises the man might have left behind. When Izuna threw out the cup of ramen that the boy was a little too fixated on, Naruto screamed in fear, "Why are you throwing the food out?" As he picked up the bag from the trash and began dragging it in the direction of the dumpster, Izuna retorted, "He was in here for who knows how long. With a man like that, you can't trust him to not have tried anything." As he followed Izuna down, Naruto questioned, "A man like that?" As he finished descending the stairs and heading outside to the dumpster, Izuna responded, "You'll learn to see it eventually." Despite the fact that the signs are similar, rather than being slightly dysfunctional like that Hitachi person, Toby has gone straight through crazy and come out on the other side. The brief and apparently pointless interaction with Toby would be remembered by Izuna and Naruto as the start of the end because of what transpired later. They both remembered the list comment and the fact that Izuna's name had been crossed off of it. Izuna could be regarded as Uchiha by anyone who wished to destroy the clan for any reason, and both were aware that Itachi couldn't have killed the entire Uchiha clan by himself. Both of them were aware that the deranged Toby had contributed to the devastation of their group and the Uchiha clan's demise, but Izuna had a suspicion that other people had also participated. Others in positions of authority. He was aware that the Uchiha, who had been pursuing death for years, had not been as secretive about their intentions as they believed. However, there had been a brief moment of relative bliss prior to the massacre, a little respite from a challenging life that both Izuna and Naruto had cherished. While it wasn't the happiest they had ever been or would be, it was a brief period of relative contentment in a life that was far from that, one that they could look back on with nostalgia as they faced the challenges that lay ahead. Hideki had joined that, instead of being a fifth wheel as he had been at first. Because he was Uchiha, Hideki had discovered people who had accepted him for who and what he was, not for who and what others believed he should be. Hideki felt better about himself because 2 of his 3 teammates were also Uchiha. Not many people in his clan had accepted him, and his parents, despite their willingness to exact revenge on outsiders for any harm done to him, had not been among them. He even yelled at the clan head for what he believed to be his lack of action. Naturally, that added to the tragedy of his passing. Deceptively normal had been the day that signaled the end of the team, the end of the Uchiha clan, and the imminence of the war that would break out almost 10 years later. As its residents went about their regular daily activities, Konoha hadn't been any more tense than usual. The sun had been shining, and the birds had been singing. The fact that Shisui had failed to show up for the team training session he had scheduled and had not sent anyone to let them know that training had been cancelled, unlike the one time he had been forced to cancel before, was the only indication that something might have gone wrong that day. The team waited for hours wondering if Shisui's prolonged absence was a strange test of patience, unaware that there would be no training that day and that they would never again receive any instruction from their sensei. At nightfall, Hokage Kakashi finally arrived and told them that Uchiha Shisui had been discovered dead in the Naka River. When he had shared this information, Izuna had given the Hokage a suspicious look because he wouldn't have ruled out the possibility that the man who had somehow come to believe that he was Naruto's mother had killed Shisui to get Naruto, with whom he had become somewhat obsessed, even though he had ignored the boy for the first 7 years of his life and had even made an effort to avoid him during that time. But fortunately for the Hokage's chances of surviving, there was another possible suspect in Shisui's murder skulking around the village. This suspect, Tobi, was a crazed lunatic who had claimed to be working on a big scheme of Madarani's. Even though a suicide note that had supposedly been written by Shisui had been left behind, neither Izuna, Naruto, or Hideki had for a moment thought that Shisui had committed suicide when they had been informed that was what had happened. However, their opinions on who killed Shisui varied, with Hideki agreeing with the clan's suspicions regarding the person who had last seen Shisui alive. Naruto had been of the opinion that it had been Kakashi, since he had found the man who had followed the team around when he was between missions to be rather scary. Izuna, who had met Itachi several times and had found a kindred spirit who was tired of war but forced to fight because he could see no other option, did not believe that the boy was the one responsible for Shisui's death. Nearly the whole Uchiha clan, including Yashira and Hideki, was massacred approximately a week after Shisui's death. During that time, the team would occasionally get together to discuss what would happen to them now that their sensei had passed away and no one had yet stepped up to take his place. Izuna and Uchiha Sasuke, who had been hospitalized due to the trauma he had experienced that night, were the only clan members remaining in the village after the massacre. Shortly afterward, Izuna took Naruto to visit the boy in the hospital, only to discover that the boy had taken on his father's demeanor and would not even engage in polite conversation. Naturally, neither of the boys had considered missing the mass funeral for the Uchiha clan, so they both attended. That was the only funeral that Yashira and Hideki would receive because there had been no interest in having separate funerals for each member of the clan and no time to space them out. It was impossible for either of them to imagine missing their funeral. Apart from the fact that Mizuki couldn't be there and someone would need to explain to his friend what had transpired during the service that he had missed, Yumino Iruka didn't really know why he had shown up at the Uchiha funeral. However, he would have gone if he could have, since one of his few friends was among the dead. Since he didn't really know many Uchiha personally and wasn't particularly friendly with those he did, he probably wouldn't have shown up if it weren't for Mizuki. His only acquaintance with Uchiha Yashira, the Uchiha with whom he had been on the best of terms prior to the massacre, was the number of times he had run into him while visiting Mizuki and discovering the two hanging out with Naruto and Izuna. Apart from his surrogate older brother, who was reportedly too preoccupied with his own sorrow to console the child, he was the only well-known and reasonably friendly face among the guests, so when he arrived at the funeral, a sobbing Naruto who had been standing next to a stone-faced Izuna had clung to him. Standing there and letting the little boy cry into his shirt made him feel a little bad because it had cost the lives of roughly half of the people who had looked after the boy and the boy in return for him to see what Mizuki had noticed in the Uzumaki child almost 3 years prior. Naruto was a fairly normal boy with normal needs and wants, aside from the fact that he had the Kyuubi sealed inside of him. He had been rejected by almost the whole village because of something he couldn't control. Instead of improving the situation, He had been making it worse by attempting to distance himself from one of the few people who had supported the boy because he was still bitter about his parents' deaths, which weren't the boy's fault. He was incredibly self-centered without even recognizing it. He had not only failed to see that Naruto was merely a lonely child in need of care, but he had also failed to recognize the years of suffering endured by his own best friend. He had no idea that his best friend since childhood had been holding in all of that anger and jealousy for so long until the day Mizuki came to him and opened up to him completely, showing him who he really was, good and bad. Like everyone else who was unaware of the incident involving his teammate, he had fallen for the man's condescending fa-section aid. In many respects, his friendship with Mizuki had become closer since that day, and if his friend hadn't confided in him, he wouldn't have realized what his friend was truly going through. Given that Uchiha Yashira had been a sort of friend of his, Mizuki ought to have been standing here, but he was on a mission. Even his superiors seemed to believe that he had killed his teammate, even though it couldn't be proven because it hadn't happened, so 2 weeks prior, his friend had departed for yet another protracted and challenging mission that would get him nowhere. Izuna was the only one who could, or rather was willing, console the crying child who had been one of the few who had bothered to attend the mass funeral for the Uchiha clan because Mizuki wasn't present and he was standing off to the side, lost in his own little world as he icily stared at the freshly dug graves. Izuna would be extremely displeased because he would never really know which side of the divide he would have fallen on in the event of a coup. Even though his clan had abandoned him first, the thought that he might abandon them for a village he didn't love was painful. Few people in Konoha, the majority of whom had been Uchiha, made life in the village at least somewhat bearable, and for whom he would have been prepared to fight to the death. They were all gone now, the Uchiha. In their own ways, even the survivors had perished. According to what he had witnessed during his brief visit to the hospital, Itachi had been driven insane by the murder of his family members, and the gentle yet pampered child that had been Uchiha Sasuke had been replaced by someone too harsh and resentful for his youth. Because he felt he didn't deserve to regain what little honor he still had by doing the right thing and killing himself, Itachi's insanity was evident in the way he spared his younger brother, which made him hate him and want to kill him. The Uchiha clan was gone, and he was the only one left to uphold its customs, which would have been lost with it, regardless of which side of the divide they would have ultimately fallen on or even why they would have carried out the coup if they hadn't been killed. His anger burned so hot it was cold, or so cold that it burned him like a flame, as he stood there gazing at the dozens and dozens of recently dug graves that had just been filled by those who had been his blood. Either way, it made no difference. His rage would be burning them too, but not quite as much as it burned inside him, because he knew who was to blame for these deaths, or at least some of the people who had been to blame. He could see that Itachi, who loved peace but had been pushed into a profession that dealt death and destruction, had been a pawn in this. Itachi could have been coerced into cooperating by holding something over his head, and that same object could have been used to hold Madara-Ni's head long ago. Sasuke and Itachi had resembled him and Madara-Ni in their youth. He must have encountered that Tobi, the man who had tried to pose as Madara-Ni and then as Madara-Ni's living avatar before being brought back to life just in time for a crucial event when he disclosed that he was aware the man was a fraud who had put Sasuke's survival ahead of Itachi's. To carry out the massacre, Tobi and his pawn Itachi clearly had assistance from someone in the village's higher ranks. If not, the people who had been watching the Uchiha compound recently would have raised the alarm when the first body had fallen, forcing Tobi and Itachi to repel half of Konoha's forces in addition to any clan members who hadn't been caught off guard. The Hokage? No, he wasn't like this. The Hokage had a tendency to overlook possible dangers, even though they might later backfire, because he was too tender-hearted. More often than not, he chose to ignore what was happening in order to maintain the village's harmony and a peace that was at best frail. It was ironic that this propensity to ignore problems was something else that could blow up in the old man's face. Since the Anbu, which conducted a suspicious number of patrols past the Uchiha clan compound, had not stepped in to help the Uchiha when the compound had become abnormally quiet, it would have had to be someone close to the Hokage who had made the arrangements that evening, someone whose authority with the Anbu was almost equal to the Hokage's own. They would soon be dead, but it didn't matter who it was at the moment. He would kill that Tobi bastard and his village accomplice if it were his last act, regardless of Madara-Ni's purported plans. He would also kill Itachi, but it would be a mercy kill for Itachi. But Tobi was dead, and his body simply hadn't come to terms with that fact in the slowest, most agonizing way imaginable. With a sigh, Kakashi turned his back on the memorial stone and made his way to the Red Bridge by Training Ground 7, where he was to meet his two new pupils. Although he had been angry that Shisui had been given Naruto when he shouldn't have, he hadn't wished the teenager actual death because of the less than ideal circumstances under which he had obtained the character while still a student. Sure, he had, but not in the way poor Shisui had passed away. For starters, he wouldn't have torn out the boy's eyes. He had been the only Junin willing to take on Shisui's remaining students following the tragic death of Shunshin no Shisui, and in reality, he had only wanted one of Tamayuro, the one he had assured Minato-sensei he would train. Izuna could take care of herself without his help. He wasn't prepared to see Naruto again at the time, even though he was aware that Izuna wasn't happy with him and that he had failed several of the tests that she had put him through. It still hurt to see Naruto now, but it hurt even more to know that the boy could and had been taken away from him. Izuna had made numerous attempts over the years to introduce Naruto to the boy who had stood there and assured her and Minato-sensei that he would look after their son in the event that anything happened to them, only to watch him flee before they could get within 10 feet of him. Given that he wanted to be there for Naruto, it was entirely reasonable that he was angry and didn't want him near her, his child. He had lost his opportunity, and given his knowledge of Kushina, he would need to put in a lot of effort to get another one. Since she had never once fallen out of character since returning to Konoha 3 years after her alleged death, Kushina, in her role as Izuna, was an amazing actor. To be honest, he wouldn't have recognized her if it weren't for that verbal tick. Really, it had been a pretty clever setup, and he could understand why the Hokage was cooperating. Since too many people were aware that Kushina was Minato's sweetheart, it would be detrimental if people began to associate Naruto with Kushina because they would soon begin to associate him with Minato. This way, Kushina could take care of Naruto without anyone noticing and endangering the boy. Who Naruto's parents were was only known to those who had been genuinely informed that Kushina was his mother, not his cousin as the rest of the village had been told, and none of them were speaking. He had been disappointed that she hadn't managed to save Minato-sensei's life when he had first discovered that Izuna was actually Kushina, but he could see why that might not have been feasible. According to the tests he had a medic who owed him run. The body Kushina was occupying was a blood relative on her mother's side, and the seal that had kept her alive had probably needed a blood relative of some kind to function. He couldn't see Minato-sensei taking over his son's body to survive because, aside from Naruto, his relatives were so thin that they didn't exist. Naturally, that raised the question of how precisely Kushina had discovered Orochimaru's underground lair and sneaked inside to place the seal on the baby, who was either a close relative of one of her ancestors on his mother's side or a clone of one of her ancestors, and why she chose not to disclose what was happening. Naturally, there is also the question of when and why she did it, since, as far as he was aware, no one had been aware of the danger Konoha had been in until the Kyuubi suddenly showed up and launched an attack. In order to wait for his students who had not yet arrived, he sat back against the railing of the bridge where his team was supposed to meet, deciding to put that problem on hold for later because he probably wouldn't receive an answer to his questions anytime soon. Izuna frowned as he saw the new sensei of the team show up at the designated meeting spot. In his opinion, Hitaki Kakashi was a bother that he wanted to get rid of as soon as possible. The man's constant tardiness was bad enough, but for some strange reason, he also believed that he was Naruto's mother. This only served to highlight the fact that, in addition to having trouble telling time, the man was mentally ill. The relationship between the two of them was, to put it mildly, strained, especially when you consider that the man who had previously shunned and avoided Naruto for years was now fixated on the boy. The Hitaki had undoubtedly lost a number of points for arriving at their team meeting 2 hours late. Since Naruto had to learn how to carry out a proper stakeout after all, he also lost extra points for failing to notice that they were waiting for him on a nearby rooftop. He signaled that it was time to leave their rooftop perch and head to their rendezvous point by nudging Naruto, who appeared to be dozing off as he watched the red bridge through their only pair of field glasses, with his elbow. The Uzumaki kid stretched and yawned, then jumped off the roof, sticking himself to the side of the building they were on and running down it. They were at their team meeting location a few moments later, both of them painfully aware of who was missing as they stood in front of a relative stranger instead of Shisui. They stood in front of their new sensei, and he said, "Sorry we're late. But, we were too busy watching an elite ninja make a complete ass of himself." Ebane. The Junin, who wouldn't be any less welcome if he hadn't taken a bath in a year, casually replied, "Yeah, whatever Izuna-chan. Make sure it doesn't happen again." He clenched his teeth but held back from speaking because he was certain that if he did express his thoughts to the lazy, one-eyed Junin as he so desperately wanted to, he would be charged before he could say, insubordination. The Hotake persisted in implying that he was Naruto's mother even though he was well aware that he didn't like it. He was undoubtedly not Naruto's mother in any way, shape, or form, and he didn't need any of the villagers to pick up on Kakashi's subtle clues and call him that. Sure, he looked after Naruto and was more of a parent to the boy than a brother these days. The Hotake startled him with a mock cheerful, "Okay." Out of rage, "Our first order of business today will be to see what the two of you can do." Yes, he would demonstrate his abilities to the man before tearing off the man's mask and the foolish smile that was clearly hidden behind it. Kakashi was inconsolable. Naruto tried his best to conceal his anxiety at being in the presence of the Kakashi individual who would be his new sensei. He had been terrified since day one by the man who had followed his team around during training and missions. Long before Shisui sensei had passed away, the man's expression had been distressing, as if he had wanted to murder him. He simply knew that the Kakashi person had played a role in Shisui sensei's death. Somehow, the Kakashi person had desired him and wanted to take him away from Shisui sensei. However, the Kakashi person was upset that Shisui sensei and Izuna had stopped him. He would try his hardest to be brave for Izuna despite his fear of Kakashi and his fear that Kakashi would attempt to harm Izuna as well. He had been shielded by Izuna since he was a small child, and she would continue to do so if the Kakashi person attempted to harm him. However, he feared that Izuna would be harmed or killed while defending him against the Kakashi individual. Shisui sensei had been extremely strong and knowledgeable about almost every aspect of being a ninja, but Kakashi had killed him. Izuna prodded at the rather large bruise on his thigh and hissed. In the past, when his name had been mentioned alongside Madara's, just as Tobirama's had been mentioned alongside Hashirama's, he was eager to regain his adult body and the greater chakra capacity and longer reach that had made him a formidable opponent on the battlefield. Now that the man was on his guard against him because of that small incident that had happened when they had first met, it was almost impossible to gain the element of surprise, which was the only way he would even have a chance of taking out the Hotake who had caused the mess he and Naruto were in. He should have ignored Shisui and dealt with him right away that day because it would have saved him and Naruto, who was now observing him with concern, a lot of trouble later. He and Naruto were in an untenable situation because the Hotake had decided to agitate him even more today and had said something during their spar that made it serious. As a result, things had gone to hell. The fact that the man had been fucked in the head was not an excuse, as it was, regrettably, a common occurrence among ninja, including his own brother. Indeed, he was determined to forget that one as best he could. He already felt guilty about recalling it. He could almost follow the reasoning behind the Hotake's belief that he was Naruto's mother, despite his mild annoyance at the fact that they continued to hold that belief. Ninjas were taught to look for the underneath in every circumstance, and the longer they were in the profession, the more they instinctively began to do so, lest they overlook a detail that was often perish as a result of their own folly. However, it had a way of driving more seasoned ninja crazy when everything was exactly as it seemed on the surface because they kept searching for something that wasn't there because they thought something had to be there. As a result of the events involving Madara and a hooker who turned out to be, well, a hooker, the wild theories began to make the ninja in question appear even more insane than they already were. The Hotake's small verbal blunders were his way of saying, "I know you're Kushina, and you know I know you're Kushina, so, let's cut the bullshit." He was aware of this. Unfortunately, there was no bullshit to cut, and every slip only made him feel more insulted especially since he had repeatedly told the man to cut it out and received a noncommittal response. If he had truly been Kushina, he probably wouldn't have objected to the Hotake's persistent hints that he was. He wasn't, though, and he was worried that the crackpot theory would be discovered by those who, for whatever reason, eavesdropped on his team's meetings and training sessions. The last thing he needed was to have his name and picture attached to a fresh entry for the red-hot-blooded habanero in the most recent bingo book. Especially when he returned to the afterlife, where Madara and the damnable Senju brothers would surely be waiting for him, he would never hear the end of it. Additionally, he had observed a hint of gender confusion in a few of the Hotake's slips, as though the man wasn't sure which gender to give him. It only served to fuel the fire between him and the Hotake, even though he would also be perplexed if he encountered a man who he thought was a reincarnation of a woman he had known all his life. He was going to kill that man someday, but it didn't seem like the right time today. He had other issues to deal with at the moment, like possibly keeping Naruto alive, in addition to the fact that he lacked the reach and chakra capacity needed to defeat an opponent like the Hotake, who was on par with the Kage in terms of skill. He had to approach the Hotake much more closely in order to engage him in combat because of his smaller stature, limited range, and diminished chakra capacity. It put him in more danger because it gave his opponent, who had a far longer reach than he did, the advantage, even though it allowed him to occasionally duck under the man's guard. When his opponent realized he had been serious during their spar, he didn't hesitate to press for the advantage. He had attempted to kill the man with a kunai, but luckily, his position as a teammate and student had kept the Hotake from going too far during that altercation, and he had managed to get away with only minor wounds. He had made every effort, but he had not had the arm strength to pierce the man's vest, which had apparently undergone some aftermarket modifications. When he was thrown into a tree after exposing the thin layer of armor plating that lined the Hotake's vest, he may have suffered multiple bruises, a few scrapes, and some bruised ribs, but he left the Hotake with a split lip and a bloody nose to remember him by. But it wasn't nearly enough, given the predicament he and Naruto were in because of that man. It wouldn't be nearly enough to be on the ground in a broken and bloody heap, where it would take a few healers an hour to realize that what they were looking at had once been human. He was drawn out of his somewhat somber thoughts by Naruto's anxious question, "Are you all right?" Naruto had followed him into the woods without question and had kept following him out of the village until he had found a suitable spot to pause and rest for a while. What transpired during Naruto's brief panic over his alleged death was, to put it mildly, intriguing. The poor boy had panicked when he had blacked out after hitting the tree and believed that the Hotake had killed him. Much shouting and screaming had taken place, and the boy was encircled by an odd orange-red chakra that seemed incredibly menacing as his face's markings changed and his eyes turned red with split pupils. After that, the boy attacked the Hotake, who had just managed to stop the child before he was able to stand up, and attempted to help Naruto regain control of himself. If the Hotake's frightened response was any indication, he hadn't done it a second too soon. The Hotake had sent them running into the woods as soon as Naruto regained some semblance of control, telling them to make sure they were who they claimed to be before they stopped except for themselves and the Hokage. As a result, the two of them were stranded in the woods outside of Konoha, with nothing to help him heal his wounds except a healing jutsu he had copied from someone who was only mediocre at it while he was fleeing from anyone or anything that might pose a threat. He had no idea why. Yes, he was aware that the Kyuubi was involved. At least he could figure that out. Other than the fact that he and Naruto were in danger and had to flee, he didn't really know what was happening. The question was whether the civilian villagers, who had irrationally wanted to get rid of Naruto from day one even though he hadn't really been anything approaching a threat until today and wasn't really much of one even now, or some ninja who had thought Naruto had escaped from whatever control the Yondaime had supposedly had him under for the last 7 euro, nearly 8 euro, years would be the source of the threat. Did he have any reason to trust the Hokage or the Hotake? Would Mizuki betray them, or could he trust Naruto's lone surviving friend among the village shinobi? When word got out about what had transpired during today's training, they could run rings around any civilian mobs that might pursue them, but for shinobi, that depended. He could manage anything below Junin by himself. Anything higher than that, and his only option would be to give his life in the hopes that Naruto would be able to reach safety. If it were Mizuki, Naruto would most likely be killed. He believed that Naruto was not yet capable of handling a betrayal by a supposed ally or trusted friend, and that another severe emotional shock might push the boy over the edge in his current state. A part of him advised against putting his trust in the Hotake, who had previously shown himself to be incredibly unstable and untrustworthy and might be the one to rescue them from this predicament. However, a different aspect of him had noticed the expression in the Hotake's visible eye when he had instructed them to flee. Fear had been present, fear for Naruto rather than fear of Naruto. Regardless of the man's obsession with the boy, despite the fact that the boy had lost it and attempted to kill him, he had appeared to be genuinely worried about his safety at that precise moment. Even though he wanted to kill the man who had put him and Naruto in this predicament, he knew that if he couldn't get them out of it completely, he could rely on him to at least tell them when it was safe to go back. He would have to guide Naruto through the woods to an old Uchiha holdout, which was presumably more than a moldering wreck at the moment, until he saw the hide or hair of the Hotake. They should be able to hide there, at least, with something that looked like shelter, until this passes or he realizes how dangerous they are and decides to run in a different direction. If they were careful, they could be able to hide in that direction for a few years. Naturally, The fact that Naruto contained the Kyuubi made things more difficult because Konoha might do anything, including starting a war, to get the boy back if they attempted to flee to another ninja village where they might otherwise be welcomed. After all, when they had something as strong as a Biju in their hands, no one voluntarily or readily let it go. As an exhausted Hokage, Kakashi was quickly explaining what had just prompted Naruto to unleash some of the Kyuubi's chakra. The first of the villagers had begun to arrive at the Hokage's office. In their panic over the fact that Kyuubi chakra had been felt in the village for the first time in almost 8 years, he could almost forgive some of their remarks, but he wouldn't be forgetting them in the event that something unfortunate happened to Naruto, and he wouldn't be following any of their advice either. Since Kushina had released a comparable quantity of the Kyuubi's chakra in the days after Uzushiyogakure's fall back before she'd managed to subdue the creature, he had a slightly better sense of what had transpired. Since the battle at the Valley of the End had occurred long before their time and the Kyuubi had not yet appeared inside the village walls, the villagers had sensed it but had no idea what it was. It had simply been another factor contributing to the general uneasiness during the dark days of the Second War. Naruto had been partially expecting this to happen for a while and had been considering his options when it did, given the amount of stress he had been under since the passing of his former sensei, one of his colleagues, and the guy who had been like an uncle to him. When he finally released the Kyuubi's chakra, he had thought the boy would have been outside the village, but it was obvious that this had not happened. Since holding a village-wide conference would be impracticable and, to be honest, impossible, he decided to compose a letter that would be delivered to every business and residence in Konoha in order to avert any potential mischief on the part of the residents over Naruto. He then handed Kakashi a lengthy C-rank task to finish with his team, sent the letter to the printers, and sent him out to locate his trainees. He had truly intended to strangle Kakashi for causing this problem, but he needed someone he could rely on to look out for Naruto's safety and best interests in order to keep Naruto safe until more sensible people took charge and everything was resolved. Unfortunately, as Jiraiya was monitoring a small-scale conflict between Suna and Iwa in the small nation that lay between the boundaries of earth and wind, the only individual who remotely met that description that he had on hand was Kakashi. There were some unresolved issues about the killing of one of that man's teammates, but he would be nearly willing to claim that he could trust Mizuki. He would therefore have to postpone any potential strangulation of the copy nin until later. As Kakashi left, he lit his pipe and leaned back, waiting for Danzo and the other two to come and begin offering even more ridiculous ideas about how to raise, feed, and train Minato's son. With every minute that went by since the hamlet had felt the Kyuubi's chakra for the first time in almost 8 years, Iruka saw Mizuki become more and more of a worried mess. Mizuki had taken care of Naruto, who up until this point had seemed like a typical youngster, and he was very troubled by whatever had happened to the boy. The worst part of it was probably not knowing what had transpired. After making a cup of his friend's favorite tea, he walked to his couch to console the elder man who had supported him over the years since his parents were killed in the Kyuubi attack. Mizuki was sitting there, murmuring to himself. Mizuki said, "He's got to be dead. He has to be. If the Yondaime's seal had broken, there'd be a giant nine-tailed fox loose in the middle of the village." A knock on the door interrupted Mizuki as she accepted the tea from him without really noticing what it was. Even though he wasn't anticipating any mail because all of his bills had been paid and anyone who would be willing to write to him could just as easily walk over to his apartment and chat to him, he left Mizuki's side to answer it, and when he opened the door, he saw a courier on his doorstep. The man took an envelope out of his overstuffed backpack and stuffed it into his hands, saying, "Letter from the Hokage." Since the Hokage had never written to him before, he was curious to see what was in the envelope, so he closed the door behind the departing courier and opened it. Despite being a mass-produced copy, the "letter from the Hokage" was certainly not junk mail because it included a mimeographed copy of the Sandame's signature euro, something that could only be used by the Hokage's office. He became increasingly irate as he read the letter. Given how much killing intent he had begun to emit, Mizuki likely sensed his mood and questioned, "What's wrong?" He snarled as he crumpled the note in his fist, wishing it was the throat of the man who had terrified the entire village and put a child in danger of being killed by the terrified villagers. Some bastard who found out that Jinchuriki released Biju Chakra when severely stressed thought it would be funny to try to provoke Naruto into going on a rampage by attacking that Izuna. Mizuki jumped from the couch, grabbed the crumpled note from him, and began reading it. "What?" he said. "So, Naruto's," began Mizuki, who appeared both relieved and worried. He said, "Alive, yes. The same won't be said about the next bastard who tries to pull something like that in the future though. For the first time, a woman across town felt sympathetic to Naruto. She read the letter the Hokage's office had written to her family again and remarked, "That poor boy." The letter that described what had happened earlier that day described how Itachi had recently slaughtered Naruto's sensei, one of his teammates, and a man who had essentially adopted the boy as his own. It also stated that the person who had raised Naruto since he was 3 years old because no one else had been left after his parents were killed in the Kyuubi attack had been attacked directly in front of him by an unidentified assailant. In his distress, the boy released a very small amount of the Kyuubi's chakra as he attempted to protect one of the few people in the village who cared about him from a much stronger opponent. Once more, she remarked, "That poor boy." The Uzumaki youngster had no one but a group of Uchiha who had likely been plotting to take advantage of him and that man who wore a child's skin while she had been ignoring him in the marketplace. The child had almost no one left but the unholy creature that had taken hold of him after Fugaku's eldest son went on a killing rampage. Someone had recently attempted to remove the child from the boy who had never experienced the kindness of a mother because the monster that had been sealed inside him had also taken his mother from him. Inquiring as to what had caused her mother's sadness, the woman's daughter said, "What is it, Mama?" "Sakura," she replied, "you know how I told you never to play with that Naruto boy." Her daughter said, "Yes. I've changed my mind." Two youngsters fled deep in the woods that encircled Konoha. One of them, who occasionally climbed above the canopy and checked the sun, had a destination in mind, so their jogging wasn't aimless. Naruto took Izuna's lead, but he had no idea where they were headed. Izuna had never led him astray in all the time he had known him, and he was positive that he would not do so now. He wasn't totally sure what he had done incorrectly, but given how terrified Izuna appeared, whatever it was had to be terrible. This and the infrequent hisses of anguish that Izuna emitted both concerned him. Given what he had stated about their destination, which was far away, he was unsure of how much longer Izuna could run. Hitaki Kakashi discovered them as they stopped to find some water since he was thirsty. "Who are you?" Izuna said, drawing a kunai 2 seconds after Kakashi emerged from the clearing where they had stopped. To which the masked man said, "Who do you think I am? Kushina-san, the Tsuchikage." "Prove it," was Izuna's icy response. Kakashi's hitai was raised. There was a normal eyelid with a scar running up and down it, rather than the depressed spot where an empty socket would be, as on that one old man he'd met. It was one of those Sharingan things the Uchiha possessed when the eye opened. With a gaze of pure hatred, Izuna placed his kunai away and faced Kakashi. Izuna sarcastically pointed at the eye that Kakashi was concealing behind his hitai and said, "I should kill you for that, if nothing else. I wish you wouldn't, it'd make it impossible for us to complete our mission." Kakashi replied. "Our mission?" inquired Izuna. "Hokage-sama gave us a mission to take until the village calms down a bit," said Kakashi. Izuna said, "So, what's the mission?" "I don't know, I haven't read the scroll yet." Izuna remarked, "Say another word, and I'll strangle you Ebane." As the group thankfully moved beneath Fire Country's trees, the complexions of the great majority of the clan ranged from pale to ghost white, which was one of the reasons why Uchiha never accepted assignments in Wind Country if they could avoid it. Because he and Naruto had left the village without any form of sunscreen, including the old Uchiha recipe that took a long time to make and was typically made in very large batches, and because of that little bit of courier work where they had ended up bringing an antique vase to Asuna, he was currently lobster red. Kakashi, who had so much flesh covered that he didn't need sunscreen, and Naruto, who was one of those fortunate bastards who tanned rather than burned, both began to snicker, which further depressed him. Given his current state of mind, when every movement was excruciating, it was likely that Naruto would lose a limb or two if he attempted to poke him once more. Although his older brother had made fun of him at every chance before his death, not even Madara had been foolish enough to do such a thing. A barter link that had sent them racing back and forth across the continent had been concluded with the delivery of the antique vase to Asuna. It seems that a wealthy Asuna resident had desired the vase but had not received the compensation that the vase's owner, who had been residing in the Fire Country capital, had requested. On the other hand, someone in Tea Country had what the person in the capital had wanted, but they had wanted something that someone in the tiny country of Wave had. The person in Wave had wanted something from someone in Lightning Country, who had wanted something from an artist in the country of Iron, who had wanted something from someone in Aim. The man from Aim had wanted something from someone in River Country, who had wanted something from someone in the middle of nowhere in Fire Country who had wanted what the wealthy man in Asuna had to offer. Although several legs of the journey passed through countries with their own ninja villages, the man from Asuna had hired a Asuna team to bring the first item to the guy in the middle of nowhere and get the ball rolling, and hired them to deal with the rest of the rigmarole. This was a better option than hiring ninja teams from at least 3 to 5 different countries to deal with this issue and possibly cause the chain to break somewhere along the line. They arrived at the house of the country bumpkin who apparently owned a sculpture that the man who had been living just outside of Tanagakure had wanted after traveling slowly for 2 days due to his injuries and the fact that Naruto wasn't really used to ninja trade Euro, although Shisui had taught him the tree hopping technique after he'd mastered tree climbing. After being carefully placed in a storage scroll, the sculpture Euro, a pretty lovely glass piece that appeared to have been one of his uncle's creations Euro, was brought to their next destination. Since the crew wasn't in a rush, the journey to River Country took 4 days, and Kakashi even paid for a night at a roadside inn when it began to rain. They traded the glass sculpture for a fairly lovely jade lion in River Country, which Kakashi examined and contrasted with the mission assignment scroll's description. They departed for the outskirts of Omegakure after both pieces were confirmed, the glass piece by a Tanagakure ninja and an antiques expert who kept casting suspicious looks at Kakashi, and the jade lion by Kakashi's Sharingan, which Izuna longed to tear out of the man's head every time he saw it because it wasn't his. They had just arrived in Rain Country when Kakashi dropped them off at a remote roadside inn and instructed them to wait for him to come for them. It seems that AIM was an unstable area, and Kakashi's money was earned in this portion of the Exalted Mail Carrier assignment. A man wearing a black cloak with crimson clouds and a hat that nearly covered his face dropped by the inn as they were waiting for the Hokage to return. As soon as he sensed a relative absence of animosity, Naruto, who was emerging from his shell after several comparatively amicable meetings on the road, immediately began chatting the man's ear off. The man's girlfriend, whom he had clearly been waiting for because he departed with her shortly after, thought Naruto was adorable and presented him an origami bird, which Naruto immediately hugged and thanked her for. They headed to what was about the halfway point of their voyage after leaving Rain Country with whatever it was that the Hokage had picked up, which was probably against the law given how disgustingly the man carried it to its destination in Iron Country. The trip to Iron Country was pretty uneventful, with the exception of Naruto asking a rather perplexed and somewhat amused warrior for his autograph and loudly and enthusiastically describing an action movie that Shisui had taken the squad to see. They had picked up the enormous cast iron lawn ornament that resembled one of those long-necked pink birds with backward-bending knees that the man in Lightning Country had desired, and Naruto had received his autograph. The client they were delivering to in Lightning Country had instructed them to set the enormous, vividly painted cast iron flamingo in his yard to just so when they arrived. They finally got the item positioned to the Lightning Country bastard's satisfaction after several hours of backbreaking labor. They were given a full set of an out-of-print manga that the new flamingo owner had remembered enjoying as a child after they had been served some beverages that, unbeknownst to him, had saved his life. But since the volumes were mint, and had to remain that way, he had not been permitted to read any of it. They couldn't help but be amazed by the strange actions of 2 men on a neighboring boat that was anchored in the canal between Wave and Fire while traveling by boat to Wave Country, which was a small and comparatively impoverished country. A fairly nerdy man wearing glasses dragged a long metal tube into the water, seemingly looking for the bottom, while a man who appeared to have a bit of a drinking problem watched. The nerdy-looking man added, "We can call it a day after we get another sample here." The comic about a planet-destroying extraterrestrial who was brought to the path of non-violence by a member of his race who had settled on a planet similar to theirs after he had been assigned to destroy it as a child was delivered without incident, although that was about the only intriguing aspect of Wave. They eventually traveled to the country of tea after obtaining a puzzle box that was clearly manufactured by the Uzumaki, to which the Hokage continued to give serious looks. In the world of tea, they exchanged their Uzumaki puzzle box Euro, which he had completely refused to claim, despite the Hokage's repeated intimations that he ought to Euro, for an antique tea set that was carefully packed away and transported to the residence of a lowly nobleman. A low-ranking nobleman in the Fire Daimyo's court eventually turned over the vase after having the set evaluated by an antiquarian who specialized in such matters. And that's when the hell started. Kakashi was practically boiling in his darker clothes, so they'd moved as fast as they could across the desert, but it wasn't fast enough. Izuna's skin had begun to burn in the second hour due to the sun's harsh rays. Despite his complaints about sand getting into his sandals and other areas, Naruto didn't seem to mind the heat or the sun. Izuna and Naruto had been sent out to Play, while Kakashi brought the vase to the client, who had requested that no kids be present in the house, where they might break things. Naruto left to see if he could make any friends, like he had in Rain Country, while Izuna had been sleeping in what little shade he could find, hissing in agony as he applied an ointment he'd bought at a local apothecary to every inch of his burnt skin and ignoring the amused looks of the local shinobi. 2 hours later, Naruto was being carried away from the red-haired devil child he had befriended, when the Kazekage himself stood there moaning with his face in his hands. "He didn't mean to break my arm, honest," Naruto said. Izuna had been stuck with Naruto poking his lobster-red skin, which had burned even more on the way out, because he had only had enough money for sunscreen and a healing salve, and he had foolishly believed the healing salve to be more important at the time. Fortunately for the devil child's continued survival, Naruto's arm had essentially healed itself by the time the team was an hour away from Suna. Izuna just wanted the pointless adventure to end by the time he arrived at Fire Country's pleasant, cool shade. He would almost be delighted to see Konoha again, given his current state of mind. Gazing at the sun's position in the sky, Naruto let out a sigh. He had finished his lunch and will shortly start his shift on the wall. He made his exit, bounced the ball back to the first-year academy students who had the day off, then grabbed and shrugged into his vest. When he was a tiny child, the only person who was willing to talk to him was Izuna, who wasn't really a kid because he had lived, grown up, and died before Konoha was created, so the kids were a little upset that he had to depart so quickly. Earlier this year, he had made Chunin at an exam in Suna, where he had reconnected with his friend. He recognized him and was open to playing with him when he had run across him in the middle of the night before the desert survival section of the exams, even if Gaara had gone into some strange, insane shell since he had last seen him. Gaara's sand was still a little out of control, but not as much as it had been when he was 7 years old and broke his arm. Given that he was significantly more skilled than the majority of his current generation and that Izuna ni recalled being 18, it was to be expected that he would make Chunin when they were 9, Tokubetsu Junin at 11, and be well on his way to becoming a full Junin. As an active ninja now, living to 18 was equivalent to living to 35 during the era of the warring clans. Izuna ni had been both exceptionally talented and extraordinarily fortunate to have lived so long. Had Hitachi not nominated them for the exams until then, Izuna ni would have become a Chunin sooner, but he and the child named Shin, who had taken the place on their team, hadn't. He had only just turned 12 when he was nominated for the Chunin exams a second time, this time to cover for an elder genin who had injured his leg on a different team that had been formed the year he and Izuna graduated. The older boys had tried to put him in his place, but had given up as soon as they recognized that he was skilled, even though he tended to be a little disorganized and inattentive and came across as somewhat dim-witted. In addition, he had learned other filthy tricks from Izuna ni that had been useful. Although he wasn't quite as skilled as the Hitachi, Chunin's age of 12 years and 4 months was respectable for a modern shinobi. There were no such ranks as genin and Chunin in his time, as Izuna ni had often reminded him, and children nowadays were extremely pampered, particularly shinobi children who weren't thrown into battle almost as soon as they could grasp a kunai, unlike him. Despite everyone who had detested him, he had been given a childhood, and a decent one at that, in comparison to Izuna ni's first time around. Nearly as soon as they arrived, the majority of the kids who had registered at the academy during the year he and Izuna ni had before graduating would be doing so. The remaining ninjas, who had been trained to genin level, would either return to their families and be used elsewhere, or they would pursue civilian careers in anticipation of a potential call to war or to protect Konoha from an invasion, as frequently occurred during peacetime when Konoha was unable to support all of the ninjas on its payroll. 9 or fewer of them would be becoming career shinobi. He, like Izuna ni, was a professional shinobi. It was impossible for either of them to be anything else. Izuna ni served, because he had no other choice, notwithstanding his frequent dissatisfaction with the community and the prior Hokages. When he asked Izuna ni why he had been left with no other option, Izuna ni gave him a sorrowful grin and assured him that neither of them would be allowed to leave the community and that he would never abandon him. He had never thought about leaving, unlike Izuna ni, despite the fact that he had frequently been unhappy with the locals. He grinned and shook his head at the ambush that awaited him 3 blocks from his workplace as he made his way to the wall where he would be on sentry duty for the afternoon and much of the evening. Due to the fact that he had clotheslined the child during one of his assassination attempts on the Hokage, the boy had refused to leave him alone ever since he had been assigned to watch over the Hokage's grandson. He wouldn't tolerate someone attempting to murder the old man, who had been one of the only individuals who had taken care of him throughout his formative years, even if it was just a silly game. After avoiding Konohamaru, he arrived at his post and remarked, "Hey Mizuki ni," upon recognizing his sentry companion. "You get stuck on sentry duty again. It's better than being stuck at the mission assignment desk, kid," said Mizuki. "I don't see how Iruka can stand it." "Speaking of standing things, the class you're teaching is graduating soon, isn't it?" questioned he. Mizuki answered, "Yes, and I'll be glad to see the back of the lot of them." "None of them are you." Having not spent much time with his generation outside of the playground, where all children were children and work and school were kept apart, he questioned, "Brats." When they tried to order him around during the games they occasionally allowed him to play, it occasionally became annoying since some of the youngsters were more domineering than others. With a mischievous smirk, Mizuki responded, "Yeah, brats. Fortunately, Iruka lets me foist most of the work off on him. Thinks it's his responsibility as an instructor." He had perpetrated a practical joke on his friend, who was often too soft for his own good. Despite his tendency toward cruelty and jealousy, Mizuki was generally a decent man. Although Iruka was his best friend and allowed him to get away with a lot, she wasn't scared to call him out on his nonsense when it mattered. Mizuki had a minor black mark on his record that had not been caused by him, but he was still good enough to be a Junin. Because of his jealous nature, he was suspected of being responsible for the death of a teammate with whom he had a strained relationship. He had been passed over for promotion on several occasions as a result. It was feasible that someone from outside the hamlet could have recruited Mizuki if he hadn't had backers who liked him and backed him. That could be extremely detrimental given that Mizuki was currently an assistant instructor, assisting in the education of the next generation. It was a close thing as it was, and Mizuki complained about his lot from time to time. He moved his focus outward, keeping an eye out for any suspicious motions, and added, "Niece." Since he and Mizuki were on the part of the wall that fronted the forest, an invasion was more likely to occur in their quarter than it would be on the most open part of the wall, which was closest to the village gates. Mizuki turned his own focus outside and remarked, "Iruka enjoys being an instructor more than I do. I can't believe I wanted to train brats for a living once I made Junin." He smirked and remarked, "I hear they get better after they graduate. But, don't quote me on that." Not mentioning the apparent truth that, aside from being a little short for his age, he was the same age as Mizuki's students, which meant that they wouldn't respect him because all the inexperienced brats would see was the surface. He went on, "I'd take your job if I could, but..." The conversation later shifted to other topics, such as what the other person might want for dinner because Mizuki's favorite food was ramen, which made him ill due to a traumatic event in his early years. As a result, they frequently made concessions when they ate together, and he completely forgot the suggestion he had made. However, Mizuki hadn't, and he had chosen to present the idea to the old man, who had apparently liked it, because he had truly wanted a vacation from the kids and the job that was wearing him down, especially since he felt underappreciated at the academy where there were fewer opportunities for promotion than on active missions. Mizuki kept his ambitions a secret from Izuna during their really pleasant supper that night, during which he tended to get his sushi. Naruto was nervously grinning up at Iruka-san, whom he would be helping till the end of the year, 2 days after his sentry duty with Mizuki. If they didn't get some diligent early risers, the A-class pupils were expected to arrive in 30 minutes. Iruka-san shook his head and remarked, "I really shouldn't have gotten into that prank war with Mizuki. I can categorically state that he won." Iruka laughed as he reviewed his duties as an assistant instructor, which included mostly gathering students, monitoring them, assisting with grading, and helping to proctor tests and the graduation exam at the end of the school year, which was drawing to a close. Running C-rank missions, performing sentry duty, or occasionally taking on guard duty was clearly not supposed to be like this. I hoped it wouldn't be the way he had described it to Mizuki. Most, if not all, of the children should have been taller than him, and they were roughly his age, with some being a few months older. The Chunin vest he wore over his orange shirt was about all he possessed to command respect. His orange clothing had drawn a lot of attention, remarks, and scathing advice about keeping up a professional appearance, now that he was no longer a genin. Hiba was the first person through the door, which surprised me. "What are you doing here?" said the child, who as usual had his dog on his head. "Mizuki needed a vacation, so I'm the new assistant instructor," he said. Hiba, who seemed strangely anxious, said, "Iruka-san, he isn't allowed to kick the students, is he?" "No, why?" inquired Iruka-san, You know how he, beat up that one guy the day he graduated. Hiba replied. You remember that, he exclaimed, recalling the unlucky first encounter he had with his late friend. Hiba remarked, everyone remembers that. He remarked, you guys never said anything about it at the park. He had assumed the incident had been forgotten because none of the children his age had ever mentioned it when they had first met while he was off duty. Hiba shot out, you weren't teaching us at the park. Naruto moaned as he dragged himself into his and Izuna's apartment through the window, instinctively kicking off his sandals and throwing them toward the door. He could state unequivocally that he was eager for the academy graduation exams to take place the following week. He hadn't objected to the minor mischievous activities that a few of the students engaged in to test the limits of his tolerance before punishing them. Without taking into account the busywork that Iruka appeared to enjoy much more than he and Mizuki, who were both men of action, this whole teaching lark wouldn't have been half bad if that had been all he had to endure. Sasuke was the issue. Ever since he had made it clear that he did not want to be associated with Izuna, the boy whom he and Izuna had tended to avoid had been attempting to establish his dominance. To the best of his knowledge, Sasuke considered adults who did not accomplish or contribute anything of value to be movable furniture. He wasn't in the same league as the other academy instructors and assistant instructors, who were 10 years older than the boy, because he was a few months younger and more highly ranked. He was consistently resisted by the Uchiha who attempted to start arguments with him. Instead of falling for the ruse, he called the boy who wouldn't listen about his actions, just like Iruka had done. Because of his obvious disrespect, the Uchiha boy's grades had dropped significantly this quarter. However, since he was so much better than the students who made the effort to study, his status as Rookie of the Year was unaffected. Sasuke would have had to watch helplessly as Shikamaru took his place at the top if he had bothered. For some reason, Izuna was reading files at the table when he called out, Sasuke again. He inquired, how did you know? Izuna responded, not raising his eyes from the files he was looking through, you only get that way after a day with Sasuke. I'd tell you to head down to the park to blow off some steam, but I know that it'll just end up being awkward, especially if one of your students happens to be there. He shuddered as he recalled the time he had pounced on a suspicious figure in the bushes and discovered it was Hyuga Hinata, who had been eyeing Maeda Guy's new student who had been performing some kind of taijutsu routine as if he were a piece of meat or something. Or even more awkward if I catch the Hyuga heiress spying on that Lee boy again. To shift the conversation, Naruto said, by the way, what are you reading? However, given that Izuna would likely tell him if it were top secret as one of his small ways to resent the village and the Hokage, and that could land them both in hot water, he probably shouldn't have asked. In response, Izuna said, the old geezer with the had decided to give me a team this year. Personally, I think it's his idea of a sick joke. He questioned, why? Because he didn't understand why the Hokage would give Izuna students when he was still small enough that the little jerks would attempt to usurp him and suffer severe injuries in the process. Giving Tokubetsu Junin pupils was not unheard of, but never when the pupils were roughly Izuna's age. Given how difficult it was for ninja to survive even with a skilled teacher leading a team, that in the training of future Leaf Shinobi should never be taken lightly. Based on current standings and barring a major upset, such as Uchiha Sasuke snapping and killing all of his classmates for instance, my team is going to be Uchiha Sasuke, Haruno Sakura, and Tanaka Hibachi. Izuna responded, seeing as I'd never hear the end of it if I failed the Uchiha Sasuke, I'm going to be forced to take the team. He responded with utter sympathy for Izuna, ouch. He knew Haruno Sakura and had the annoyance of getting to know Sasuke, but he had no idea who the hell the Hibachi kid was because he wasn't one of the kids he usually played with in between missions. Sakura wasn't a particularly bad kid, she was slow in textbook at taijutsu and took a little while to aim, but she made up for it by being very motivated in school and winning the highest scores in first aid and more esoteric subjects like making poison. The issue was that whenever Sasuke, anything about Sasuke, or Sasuke himself appeared in her presence, her brain seemed to shut down. In response, Izuna said, I know. Someone should have washed the Hibachi kid out ages ago. Bad attitude and even worse grades, and he's going to skate because of Sasuke. Knowing that the meal would taste of his annoyance if he allowed Izuna to cook while he was in that mood, he said, I'll get started on dinner. Izuna turned a page in the file he was concentrating on and said, thank you. Days later, Naruto concluded that, as many academy instructors whose names weren't Yumino Iruka were known to do, it would be best to be a little more inventive with the grades. But things went a little wrong. Naruto, Iruka exclaimed, observing him marking the test sheet of the Uchiha boy. "Why are you trying to fail Sasuke?" In response, "Honestly Iruka-san, I'm trying to save his life. If he ends up on Izuna's team, Izuna's going to kill him." Izuna looked at what he had been given and sighed. In terms of appearance, Hibachi had the kind of rather forgettable features that would make him ideal for infiltration. Sasuke was almost exactly like him, and the pink-haired Haruno girl was taller than he was now. Regarding the team's actions, they were not coordinated. Sasuke was essentially being harassed by the Haruno girl, who just sat there and took it while Hibachi worked alone in the corner. "Normally," he said, drawing the attention of his students, which made the third twitch and two of them start violently. "Normally, this is the point where I announce the second graduation test, which is meant to weed out those who can't band together and work on a team even when one's own self-interests are at stake. But since I'd probably have a torch-wielding mob on my doorstep which would take time and effort I do not want to expend during my spare time to deal with if I failed the so-called last of the Uchiha, all three of you are going to skate by both for political reasons and because I don't want to be bothered by idiots who seem to think I should pass Sasuke because he's Sasuke. Try to skate with me however, and you'll live just long enough to regret it." Sasuke reportedly tried to begin the old tricks he had been using on Naruto with him when he said, "What do you mean, so-called last of the Uchiha? I disowned Itachi, and you used to be a Uchiha." He responded, almost delighted to be dropping this exploding kunai on the brat. "No one's told you about it, probably because aside from Naruto, Itachi, whoever his accomplice was, and they don't know. But there's some wackadoodle named Toby who was partially responsible for the massacre and quite possibly responsible for Shisui's death running around." It was well worth it to see Sasuke's stunned expression. After all, being loyal to the clan did not require you to put up with all of your jerkish relatives. To avoid being tempted to participate in some friendly fire, you tended to keep some family on the opposite side of the battlefield. As evidenced by the instances in which one of that lot had forced one of their relatives into his path, the Senju tended to have the same issue. "I'm going to tell you right now, before you go and swear revenge on him like you did on Itachi, who's more deserving of a mercy kill, that I've already claimed that right," he stated. "What gives you the right?" Sasuke asked icily, seemingly waking from his stunned daze. Madarane's blood, however diluted it may be by your idiot relatives, obviously didn't do you any favors. You've got all his broodiness, and all his arrogance, and none of his redeeming qualities. A Uchiha is a Uchiha until death and beyond, and I have every right to avenge my clan if I so choose. The fact that I died doesn't negate the fact that I was co-head of the Uchiha clan, and therefore partially responsible for said clan. Your father may have tried to put me in my place, in order to avoid a power struggle later on, but you aren't even close to being your father, and I am not missing as great a number of chunks of my memory, nor am I a great deal smaller than you physically," he said, deciding to show the Uchiha boy his place early on so he knew exactly where he stood with him. It was clear from Sasuke's face that he didn't like where he had placed him. Since the brat had chosen to take on his father's apparent attitude issue when he was younger, he should have reconsidered pushing him away if he had wanted more standing with him. Sasuke was now one of those relatives whose tent might, accidentally, get burned, instead of being treated like a beloved family member as he would have been if he had been a little kinder. As they say, you reap what you sow. When he saw who had arrived at the mission assignment office to turn in his report, Naruto exclaimed, "Hey Mizuki ni." With excitement, "How'd your mission go?" When Mizuki approached him to talk, he said softly, "Horrible. It rained for a week straight, one of my teammates got hit by lightning and everyone's blaming me because we had an argument an hour beforehand, and Orochimaru tried recruiting me again. There are times when I'm almost tempted, but I keep getting the sneaking suspicion that he's trying to set me up to be a patsy for something." "Damn," said Naruto empathetically. "You've got the worst luck." Mizuki ruffled Naruto's hair and said, "Well kiddo, gotta go. I've got a date with Tsubaki." He seemed to be more affected by his mission than he admitted. The Hokage sighed after observing the entire exchange and realizing how close he was to losing a devoted Konoha ninja. The dark side was a little understaffed lately, but few people would work with Mizuki if he were promoted because of certain rumors. The only reason he hadn't made the offer earlier was because he had been worried that the emotionally fragile man would be consumed by the darkness of Anbu service. However, it appeared to be the only way he would keep him around. Naruto, just avoiding another of Momochi Zabuza's blows, screamed, "This isn't what I meant when I said I wanted a new and exciting mission. This is so far above my pay grade it isn't funny. Between coughing fits, Gecko Hayate choked out, "The next time I hear the words, 'easy walk in the park,' I'll remember to double check who's saying them, who they were raised by, and who they were trained by." As he repelled multiple blows from one of Zabuza's water clone's sword. No wonder everybody runs when you say, "easy money." From his position protecting Tizuna, Fueno Dekoku shouted, "The next time I want an adventure, I'll just satisfy myself with cleaning the undersides of the student desks. The next time a former colleague asks me to fill out a team during an academic break, I'm going to tell them where they should shove their request." "Okay, who could have passed for an older genin?" yelled, "I don't even know why I agreed to come, especially after you told me you randomly picked my name off a list." From where he was barely losing to one of Zabuza's water clones, which possessed only 30% of Zabuza's power. Naruto screamed, "Look, we just have to hold our own until the reinforcements arrive." As he leapt back to avoid being cut in two. "Reinforcements?" exclaimed Hayate. "What reinforcements?" Naruto retorted, "Weird shit always keeps happening during out of village C ranks. So, when those two yahoos jumped out of that mud puddle, I took Izuna's, and Mizuki's, and Iruka's and that Kakashi bastard's advice and..." Dynamic entry. Given the amount of shit that could slip past genin and inexperienced chunin, Izuna frowned as he watched the brats he referred to as his team half-ass the gate duty, which ought to be limited to high-level chunin and above. Although it wasn't the main gate and very few people used this route unless they had business in the historical district it served, the idea behind it was the same. He had only accepted this unappreciated task, which his team made even worse, because he was fairly certain that it would result in the least amount of conflict among his students. In the brief weeks he had had the team, every other D and low C rank mission he had undertaken with his students had ended in utter disaster. Sakura tried every strategy she could find in some teen magazine to get Sasuke's attention, but he consistently defied him, and Hibachi, who had an excessive amount of admiration for Sasuke, followed his example. He had made it plain to his team when he had accepted this mission that playing around at the village gates and disobeying his orders here would be illegal, and that if his lovely students made a mistake, it would not only be him suggesting that they be taken to a tribunal. No amount of political pressure from citizens who appeared to have romanticized the Uchiha clan, whom they had once all too willingly accused of horrible crimes, could save the career of Uchiha Sasuke if he made a mistake while manning one of Konoha's gates. He had made sure the boy was aware of this. The boy was not particularly concerned about his future profession, but he was concerned about the ruined opportunities for retaliation against Uchiha Itachi that would surely arise from his expulsion from the shinobi forces and his subsequent relegation to the role of civilian breeding stock for future Uchiha. Hopefully, the new Uchiha wouldn't be as bad as a large percentage of the previous group had been. The only thing holding Sasuke in line was his fear of losing his opportunity for retribution. If only it were just. The elderly civilian Sasuke had just waved through asked, "Aren't you going to tell me to have a nice day, sonny?" As he gathered his paperwork, which Sasuke had hardly looked at. The elderly man had a peculiar appearance. For starters, he appeared much more amused than the circumstances called for. What a waste, what a waste, what a waste. Even though he was tempted, he knew that if he allowed this mess to continue, he would be on the dock with that damned grandnephew of his, facing charges. The old man was giving off the impression of being a very experienced ninja, and he landed in front of him after leaping out of the tree where he had been hiding while he gave supervision. It would be difficult to bring down this guy, whoever he was. Izuna snarled, keeping his nerves in check despite the fact that his students would be hostages at worst and sitting ducks at best. "I suggest you stop right there," the old man said. "No need for that, dearie," and then he dropped his henge to reveal that he was none other than Hitaki Kakashi, whom he had assumed was well shot of when Naruto had created Chunin. "I just wanted to see how my precious student and her students were getting along." Hibachi's eyes filled with unholy amusement as all three of Izuna's students mouthed, "Her," behind him. There was a look of amusement that he would be beating them to death again as soon as he had the chance, without one of those shinobi who seemed to believe that genin were valuable objects that needed to be protected watching him from the sidelines, ready to report him for attacking his students when he wasn't in training. Izuna added, and, hoping to advance the discussion and get the Hitaki bastard to leave before causing damage that would require time and several beatings to fix. "I could have pulled a better team out of an advanced syphilis ward in Iowa at random," replied the Hitaki. Izuna attempted to protect at least some of his reputation from the harm his students were doing to it by saying, They'd be a lot better right now, or they'd be dead if it weren't for that whole protect the genin lot who seem to think those brats are children. I wanted to train them in the old way, but the Hokage told me to go piss up a rope the first time I requested an A-ranked mission for the team. At this declaration, Sakura and Hibachi appeared horrified and stunned, while Sasuke's expression was as shocked as a Uchiha could appear without appearing out of character. Izuna thought Sasuke's expression of shock was all the more absurd because he was attempting to keep his mask of aloofness intact. Kakashi began walking down the street, saying, "Well, I'll leave you to it then, Izuna." Kakashi continued, pointing to Izuna's pupils, "And, between you and me, I've never seen anything and I will never see anything." "Gee, thanks," said Izuna. "I'll remember that when you and I are the last two people on Earth and there's no one else left to give me a character reference. Goodbye," Izuna continued, emphasizing that it was long overdue for Kakashi to perform the traditional shinobi disappearance act and leave the immediate area so that Izuna and his group could resume their work. Leaning against the wall of Tezuna's house, Naruto began, "Phew. Sorry we got your team involved in this cluster." Maeda Guy, who was recovering from several injuries, glared at the bridge builder who had rented Naruto's improvised four-man cell for a mission that was obviously not AC rank. "Say no more, Uzumaki-san. We all underestimated the severity of this mission. I'm just glad Momochi Zabuza had gotten bored waiting for us and had decided to play with us." Okay replied, "We wouldn't have lasted long enough for you guys to arrive otherwise." Coughing out of his own wounds, Gekko Hayate asked, "Can you imagine what would have happened if a genin team had drawn this mission?" Reminiscent of the recent battle, Daikoku remarked, "The only way a genin team would have survived that would have been if they'd been the Sannin back when they were genin and the professor had been doing all the heavy lifting." Naruto pointed to the bound, feminine-looking boy who had been rendered paralyzed by several surgically accurate Juken strikes delivered by a certain Hyuga Neji and asked, "So, what are we going to do about our prisoner?" Daikoku, the senior shinobi with the fewest injuries, declared, "I'll take first watch." With all the gratitude he could muster through his exhaustion, Hayate said, "Thanks, I owe you." Everyone who had fought had felt a sense of gratitude. Even with the great Maeda Guy helping out, the recently concluded battle had been a hard-fought one that had been touch and go at times. With Guy's students primarily playing support roles and staying far back of the main fighting, the conflict between Momochi Zabuza and the Konoha ninja had primarily been one of attrition. The great demon of the mist eventually wore down and lost his energy. He started to stumble and make mistakes because he was tired. A number of Senbon had flown into the battle, precisely placing themselves in the demon of the mist's neck to bring him down during one particularly severe loss of balance in which he had almost been struck by Gekko Hayate's sword. They had discovered that the Hunter Nin had been another adversary when Gekko Hayate had made the decision to do the Mist Hunter Nin a favor and ensure that Momochi Zabuza had been properly killed. The fight with the Hunter Nin, who appeared to be a year or two older than Guy's students, was shorter and ended almost as soon as Neji was within striking range. Everything was now finished, with the exception of deciding what, if anything, to do about Gato and his mercenaries and how best to treat Izuna to set an example that would make people reconsider ever misranking a mission to avoid paying the fees for a higher ranked one. Naruto knew that the harm he caused now would save lives later, even though he didn't want to see anyone hurt, least of all a man attempting to save a suffering nation ruled by a tyrant. Perhaps it was the life of a person he loved. Even though the information was unpleasant, Izuna had made sure he was aware of it so he wouldn't go out and carelessly save someone who might later kill him, even if it wasn't their fault. Killing innocent people was a part of being a shinobi, even though he detested it and wished it weren't. He only wished he had more time before beginning. He had more time to act as though everything was different, that he could come in and save everyone, and that he would never regret his decision to save people. However, if they allowed Izuna to go, more would attempt to follow in his footsteps, using their fear-based need as an excuse. Unwary shinobi who weren't prepared or highly ranked enough for the mission would heedlessly walk to their deaths, thinking it would be easy, just like they had done before they encountered Momochi Zabuza.
So this was it for this story. I hope you enjoyed it. To watch more series like this, subscribe to my channel. Till then, we weeb offline.